Yeah, man. Good morning, everyone. This is going to be a little bit interactive, whether you like it or not, because I'm not just going to stand up here and spray. So my name's Keith. As you said, I'm an ER doc. I'm also an EMS physician. I did a fellowship in EMS, and EMS has kind of been my passion. We're going to talk today about blood physiology. This guy right here, anybody know who this person is? Probably not. Okay, his name's John Holcomb. He's a trauma surgeon. He was in the Battle of the Black Sea, which is Black Hawk Down. All right, he was one of the trauma surgeons there. He was a young Army surgeon at the time. I think it was his second rotation, and he was pretty impacted by what happened then. So how did most of the guys that died in Mogadishu, did they have the cough, cold? Yeah, they lost blood, right? And they received, what was the resuscitation fluid that they received? Normal saline, right? So those two things kind of did not sit well with Colonel Holcomb, and then he spent the next 28 years of his military career trying to fix that, right? If you've ever put on a tourniquet, it's probably because Colonel Holcomb did some research that showed that was effective, or he was a part of it. If you type into Google, like John Holcomb, or try tourniquets or blood, this guy's going to come up. He's got over 650 research papers, and he's on the board of like 30 journals. So when I did my training in Houston, I was EMS physician at the Houston Fire Department, and I worked at the trauma center where Colonel Holcomb worked, and I was fortunate enough to work with him on a number of projects. And so he's kind of my mentor, which leads us to my passion for hemorrhage control and trying to save trauma patients. Now, we have a lot of trauma patients that come to the trauma centers, and they often die. They die at a very high rate. And no matter what you do in the trauma center to try to get that to stop, we can't, they can't crack the code, right? They can't bring those resuscitation numbers down. And one of the reasons is that when you're a trauma patient, all right, what do we do about strokes? You identify a stroke, and then what? You book it to a stroke center, and they try to open up the vessel. If it's a bleed, then they do something, they clip it or do whatever they need to be done for a bleed. What about a heart attack? A STEMI, right? You all have a code STEMI, right? So what is the problem? Is that the vessel is blocked, there's no oxygen getting in that tissue dies, and we can't get it back, okay? So I want to try to relate those things that we know about really well to trauma. Trauma is a whole body STEMI, right? Once you go into a certain level of shock, your whole body, every organ system, your gut, your kidneys, your brain, your heart, they all go with oxygen for a period of time, and you can't get it back, right? So as time goes on. Well, what we're going to try to do is prevent those people from going into that level of shock by keeping those tissues oxygenated, all right? And then we can prevent it. And the science shows that if we can get blood on board early, all right, we can save lives, all right? If I told you that there was a medicine that would save heart attack patients between 4 and 20 times more than we are now, how popular do you think that would be? Extremely popular. What if I told you that there was a medicine that could save stroke patients 4 to 20 times more than we are now? Pretty impressive, right? Well, we don't have that. But with trauma patients, whole blood, if given in the first 13 minutes from EMS arrival, is 4 to 20 times improvement in survival. And for every 1 minute of time that goes on, for every 1 minute of delay, there's an 11% increase in mortality. So they die 11% more often for every 1 minute that goes by. So if you can turn that around and run it backwards, right, there's something happening in the body that we have to fix early on, and this is how we do it. So if it's blood loss that's happening, it doesn't take a genius to figure out, well, if they're losing all their blood and that's what's causing the problem, what do we need to do? put blood back in them, right? Stop the bleeding and put blood back in them. And if we can't stop the bleeding, then we just keep putting blood in them until we can get them to the trauma center, get surgery, and get the bleeding under control. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So I've given, this is, I don't know how many classes we've given on this, but I think this is our fourth rotation through this. And the feedback I get is like, hey, Dr. Gates, just tell me what to do. I'll do it. Like, I'm going to give you, you tell me to give me blood, I'm going to give blood. But what is the one question that we should be asking ourselves? Why? Right? If you're in the military and they say, oh, you're going to go on a secret mission, all right? And you're going to go behind enemy lines in this convoy, and you're going to find your target, and you're going to destroy it, right? And you go, okay, I'll do that. And then you go on your mission, and about halfway there, your column gets all shot up, you're out of your vehicles, you don't know where you are, but you never ask the question why. You can't complete your mission, right? But if you knew why, you'd say, well, I got 3 vehicles left, I know kind of where I am, I recognize that hilltop, I'm going to go around, I'm going to make things happen. So the why is very important, right? You should have a basic understanding of what you're doing so that when you show up on scene, your priorities are in order. You go, oh, we don't have blood now, or we don't have this now, but I know that I need to get oxygen to those tissues. So what are the things that I can do to stop the bleeding, get oxygen, and where can I link up, and all these other things so you know what the priorities are, right? Similarly, you're going to go like, hey, Dr. Gates, why are all your references military? I don't know, just how I work. If I'm a sniper, right, if I'm really good at shooting, right, if I'm a straight infantry soldier, they're going to be like, here's a rifle, safe semi-burst, hit the switch, shoot anybody that's not dressed like you. Roger, got it. I'm going to big smile on my face and go about my business, right? But if I'm a sniper, I'm going to be really good at what I do. What do they understand about? Ballistics, wind, heat, environmental conditions, all of these things play into it. So you have to understand the science a little bit to just pull the trigger and send a bullet down range. Who's more effective? Who's better? The sniper with more training. So the more information you have, the better. The other thing is we're going to go through some science today, and you'd be like, what do I need to know about the Krebs cycle for, Dr. Gates? That's ridiculous. Well, again, it's just, you don't just sit back and enjoy the story, right? There's not a test at the end of this. You don't have to take notes or anything like that, but I'm going to tell you the story about how this goes and why it's important, right? Everybody tracking so far? Okay, cool. So this laser does not point at that screen, so I'm going to walk in front of the screen and point at some stuff. So our mission is to deliver oxygen to the tissues. What is it called when you fail to deliver oxygen to the tissues? Shock, right? What's the definition of shock? A lack of oxygen at the tissues, right? So we have to deliver oxygen to the tissues. So if we're going to try to mitigate shock, we have to understand how do we get, again, the why, right? How do we get oxygen delivered to the tissues? Well, what's your favorite color, red or blue? Blue? I thought it would be red since we're in a fire department, but maybe you're not on the fire service. All right, so we'll start off with blue. So we have to have a concentration of arterial oxygen to push out to the tissues. That's the liquid that we're trying to deliver, right? Well, in order to put oxygen into that fluid and push it downstream, we have to have something to carry those oxygen molecules. That's hemoglobin, right? The more hemoglobin we have, the more oxygen we can carry. People who live at high altitudes in Nepal have extremely high hemoglobin levels. If you go up and you spent a week on Denali, or we could do Denali, we do Rainier, whatever mountain, your hemoglobin levels in your body are going to increase, right? Because your body needs more oxygen. All right, then you have to have a pressure of atmospheric oxygen or arterial oxygen. Wait, this is arterial oxygen. Pressure of arterial oxygen in your body, right? We have to have the oxygen over the solution to push that oxygen into the tissues to get it into the blood. And then we have to have the fraction of inspired oxygen. So what fraction of inspired oxygen are we breathing right now? 21%. You have heard that before, right? Now, if I go up to the top of Rainier, is it still 21%? Yes, it's still 21%. The oxygen molecules are farther apart because the pressure is less, right? So The more pressure you have at sea level, it takes that 21% of those molecules that are further apart and it pushes them together and forces it down into the solution, right? How can we increase the fraction of inspired oxygen? Turn it up to 25, right? You put an oxygen mask on them and you blow in, or you intubate them, and then you crank up your oxygen concentration. That's where the fraction of inspired oxygen is. So we have to have something to carry it. We have to have the atmospheric pressure to push it into the blood, and we have to have a certain concentration of oxygen that we're going to put. And if we can manipulate these things, we can manipulate this, right? Which will give us more of that. So that's one thing to consider. Now, we have to take this fluid and we have to get it out to the tissues, all right? So the way we're going to do that is we're going to have a cardiac output, all right? Our pump that's going to be pumping the solution around needs to pump our oxygen to the tissues, the fluid to the tissues. And we do it at a certain rate depending upon what the situation is, right? What the demand is downstream. So if you're having a heart attack and your body's not getting enough oxygen to the tissue of the muscle, you're going to breathe faster and you're going to take deeper breaths, right? And your heart rate's going to go up to compensate, all right? It's more stroke volume or more cardiac output. We're going to take the stroke volume. Now, the stroke volume is the amount of blood that's coming out of the heart with each pump, right? A certain volume. So if I have this bottle here and I'm just handing them off slowly, right? I can increase my heart rate and I'm going to have more blood downstream. Simple, right? Okay. So how do we manipulate the amount of blood that comes out of the heart with each pump, right? We want small volume, a normal volume when we're relaxed. We want a bigger volume when we're trying to run. Okay. It has to do with preload, contractility, and afterload. All right, so what is contractility? It's the squeeze, right? So a good example of trying to explain this to you is I'll explain the pathology of it first. If a person's had 6 or 8 heart attacks or even one big heart attack, and then their heart is trying to squeeze with a big area of dead muscle, are they going to get very much contractility? No. Their ejection fraction, the amount they're going to get out of the heart with each squeeze, is going to go down. And that's the CHF population that we deal with, right? But if I'm young and I'm healthy and I'm exercising, and my heart is relaxed and it can expand and I can get a good volume out and then squeeze 65%, 55% of that volume out with each pump, I'm going to get good volume out, right? So contractility is very important. And we have drugs that we use in CHF patients and people who are having heart attacks and people who are in cardiac arrest to augment the squeeze, right? Yes? Okay, good. I'm just making sure you guys know what we're talking about or why you're pushing those drugs. All right, so contractility, that's a big one. Preload. All right, now, I was up at Crystal Mountain yesterday with Jeff North, and we broke out this ultrasound. Someone was kind enough to donate an ultrasound to the program up there, to the medic program. And Jeff's like, hey, show me how to work this thing. So we were messing around with it. I had my shirt off. All the ski patrollers looking at us like we're nuts. And we're checking things out, right? Looking at my kidneys, looking at my liver. You know, it's all swollen and saturated. Some parts of it are kind of dead. No, I'm kidding. But then we put it on the heart. And I always try to explain to people, listen, when you breathe in, right, the active phase of respiration, when your chest expands, you pull fluid into your heart. I said that 1,000 times. And I've ultrasounded a bunch of people 1,000 times, more than 1,000 times, right? I've looked at hearts and all these other things. But yesterday, I put the ultrasound on my heart and I took a deep breath because I couldn't find it. I was like, where is that thing? Do I have one? And then I went like this, and my heart went like this, and it got huge. And I was like, whoa, that's what I've been talking about, right? This visual. I didn't think it was that powerful when you take a deep breath to pull that fluid in. It's pretty phenomenal. It's magnificent. So when you breathe in, you get this preload, right? You pull blood from your SVC and your IVC, and it fills up that right ventricle, and your whole heart swells up, right? And if I'm going to increase the amount of volume in my heart right before it squeezes, well, what's going to happen to it when it goes out the other end? I'm going to get a larger delivery downstream. Okay, so that's preload. Now, how do we crush, just to step out of the blood for a minute, how do we kill people in paramedicine? Intubation. Okay, I heard everyone say intubation all together. Intubation is what we take it from this negative inspiratory value where their chest is pulling up and out, and we're pulling all this blood into the heart so that they can deliver it to their tissues, but they're in shock. And then we fill up these 2 pneumatic airbags in the chest, and we crush that hydrostatic pressure trying to return to the heart. We squeeze it out of the heart. Boom! Their pressure drops and they die. Okay, that's the peri-intubation cardiac arrest that you may or may not have experienced. So we always resuscitate before we intubate, and that's why. Preload, super important. Now, so we have preload, we need that to load up the pump. Then we have contractility, that muscle on the heart that's going to squeeze down and push the blood out, all right? Now we need afterload. What is afterload? Afterload is the ability to get that fluid from here to there. So I'm going to put some fluid from here to that door, all right? Now, if I'm using a 2-inch fire hose and I have a certain amount of pressure, I maximize the pressure behind it, it's going to come out at that door with a pretty significant force, right? But if I have that same pressure and that same volume and I put it in a 4-inch hose, what's the pressure going to be like coming out that end? It's going to be sucky, right? It's not going to work well at all. That's afterload. We need the vessels to constrict around that fluid so that we can deliver it downstream. What's a drug that we use to do that in sepsis all the time? Norepi, Levophed, right, exactly. This is Levophed, all right? So Levophed is increasing the afterload to deliver blood to the tissues. So we talked about drugs, where I alluded to some drugs that can increase contractility, some drugs that can increase the afterload, and I talked about how to crush the preload, right, with intubation. So if you kind of think about those concepts in your mind, you'll get a sense of, well, if that's what creates the stroke volume and the amount that's going out and downstream, and we increase the rate at which we're doing that, well, of course, we're going to increase our cardiac output or maintain it so that we can deliver the oxygen. Do you see why this slide is so important? I love this slide. Okay, so we need to deliver oxygen to the tissues. Great. What's the question? Why? Why do we got to send oxygen to the tissues? All right. So what kills trauma patients? There's something called the lethal triad. Maybe you've heard of this: acidosis, coagulopathy, and hypothermia. And now they're calling it the deadly diamond because we add hypocalcemia. Calcium is, and I'll show you that in the next talk, but this talk we're going to do the lethal triad. Calcium is effective in many different functions that occur in physiology. So it goes down in trauma when you're bleeding. But for our purposes, acidosis, coagulopathy, and hypothermia, all right? Acidosis, or coagulopathy, and hypothermia. I want you to keep those concepts in your mind as we talk about this stuff. All right, so what are the major function of blood? That's a pretty simple question with a very complex answer. But for our purposes, it maintains the pH of the blood, all right? It provides warmth, and it carries the things that help us coagulate. So what kills trauma patients? A lack of blood, right? Essentially. Okay, what is this? Science, exactly. Boredom, all right? That's an enzyme, all right? And enzymes are used in just about every single chemical reaction that occurs in our body. So if I take substance A and I take substance B, and these two things react to form something that I need to happen in my body, and I put them in this cup, which is my body, for example, and if I just poured them in and they just reacted, they're just going all the time, I'd just be a mass of chemical reactions worse than I am now, right? But if I had something that could control it, say if I put A and I put B in here and they just sat side by side until I dropped an enzyme in there, and the enzyme poof, made that reaction go to fruition, I could control the rate of I could keep my substrates handy when I need them, and I could control when things happen, right? That's what enzymes do. They're controllers for chemical reactions for all of the different magic that happens within our body. All right. So why do we care about enzymatic action? And if I just told you that enzymatic actions control everything that happens in my body to include coagulation, etc., how does hypothermia and acidosis affect those enzymes, right? So here's a slide which shows the rate of effectiveness of the enzymes. So this is the rate of, I didn't do that. The rate of enzyme action. So when the enzymes are working their best, it's up here. When they're not working very well, down here. Okay, so check this out. Where do enzymes in our body work the best? At what pH? 7.35, 7.45. Oh, that's weird, right? That's my pH. Cool. All right, so it seems that if we can keep that pH pretty normal, then the enzymes are going to work good. I'm going to have a better survival, right? I'm going to do better. That makes sense, right? Okay, tracking. All right, the effective temperature. All right, this is going to blow your mind. You're never going to see this coming. So the rate of action of enzymes with temperature. At what temperature do enzymes work the best? 98.6, right? My body temperature. So if we say that what kills trauma patients is hypothermia, acidosis, now we can understand why. Nothing works when we're acidotic and cold. Our body shuts down and all the things that keep us alive, they don't work. Cool? All right. I told you there was not going to be a test. There's going to be one test question. It's on this. It's called the coagulation cascade. So memorize it. All right. There are many steps in coagulation cascade when you go from tissue injury to forming a clot, okay? When you tear the tissue, the mucosa layer, which keeps everything covered up, is removed and the subcutaneous tissue is exposed, these molecules are subsequently exposed. And those molecules activate a coagulation cascade which causes platelet activation and clot formation. That makes total sense, right? You injure the tissue, you form a clot. Each one of these steps is controlled by an enzyme. Very well. So if we need these enzymes to work to form clots and they're acidotic and they're cold, how well is the coagulation cascade going to work? It's not. It's going to suck. And that means that they're going to die, right? They're going to bleed out, they're going to die. Acidosis, coagulopathy, which we're talking about here, not forming clots. What's the other one? Hypothermia, right? Everyone get that? Cool. All right. Now, why do we need to deliver oxygen to the tissues? Well, this is why. So we breathe in oxygen. It goes to the lungs. It gets uptake. Then we deliver it to the tissues, all right, in the brain or the muscle. And there it goes to a little organelle, I think it's called the mitochondria. What is the purpose of the mitochondria? The powerhouse of the cell. Awesome. So everyone knew that one. It's like third grade biology coming out. Yeah, that happens every time. So what is the mitochondria? Why is that so important? So the mitochondria has an outer membrane which holds it together, and it has an inner membrane, all right? What is the purpose of this inner membrane that's so wavy and surface area? So the reaction that we're looking for happens along this membrane here, all right? Hydrogen ions are pumped from here to here. They accumulate here in a higher concentration, and then they run back through a little powerhouse right there, a little wheel, which creates a molecule called ATP. What is ATP? It's the molecule that powers all of the processes in our body. So this is the membrane, that inner membrane that we're talking about, right? This is the inside, and this is the space between the outer membrane and the inner membrane. So what's happening is we're using this molecule called NADH to power these channels, which are pumping actively hydrogen ions to accumulate in this space. We're building pressure, we're building a gradient. And with that gradient, it comes over here and it pushes through this last channel, creating ATP and that energy. We need all of these processes to occur in order for this last one to occur. In the third one, you are required to put in oxygen. If we don't have oxygen, this one does not work, okay? Now, let's see if I got down there. I don't. Cyanide. Anyone ever heard of cyanide? It's a pretty effective way of killing an organism, right? So cyanide blocks this step right here. That's how important this one step in the mitochondria is, the one with the oxygen. If we block that, the organism dies because it can't create ATP. Similarly, if you're a trauma patient or a patient in shock and you're not receiving the oxygen that you need, it is very similar because it acts at the same place that cyanide acts. I'm not saying that it's the same way to kill somebody, but it's pretty effective. Okay? All right. So that NADH molecule, right? Don't get blown away by this. It comes from something called the Krebs cycle. All right? The Krebs cycle uses a bunch of different reactions that we get from glucose to create the NADH, which is step one over there, right? So we need the glucose to power the chain to use the oxygen to create the ATP. Is everyone tracking on that? See how I simplified that super complex stuff? Now, for every molecule of glucose, through that whole process that we just talked about, if you're using the aerobic cycle for using oxygen, all right, you're going to get 36 ATP molecules each time it goes through. We can break it down. Does that make sense? Okay. So if we're doing the anaerobic metabolism, where we take a glucose molecule without using oxygen, we create 2 ATP. 36 versus 2. Which one is more effective? Aerobic metabolism, right? That's what I heard you all say in unison. So the anaerobic system is for short bursts, right? If you have to run quickly to escape something, or if you're temporarily out of oxygen or oxygen is depleted, it's a good redundant system to back it up. But it's nowhere near effective to supply the things that you need to stay alive, right? So anaerobic metabolism is not as good as aerobic metabolism, but it still helps. Is everybody tracking so far? Anybody's like mind is blown and you're just like, I'm done. Okay, cool. Because we're going to continue the concepts. All right, so this next one, we're going to talk about oxygen extraction ratios, which is the ratio of oxygen consumption. Has anyone ever heard of VO2 or VO2 max? What's your VO2 max, dude? Right? Athletes, right? Especially performance or distance athletes. Lance Armstrong was a great example of someone who, even though when he was not on steroids, he still had a very high VO2 max. VO2 max, or VO2, is the ability to take a certain amount of oxygen and create ATP. So if you have a high VO2 max, you can utilize a lot of oxygen and create a shitload of ATP, right? So you're really good at making ATP is another way of saying VO2 max, right? If you have a lot of mitochondria in your body, as you do when you start to work out, your ability to make more ATP is going to go up, and therefore your performance will go up. Does that make sense? So VO2 max is important because it tells you how well you can use the system that I just explained to you, right? Okay. All right, so global oxygen delivery, DO2, is the amount of oxygen delivered to the tissues per minute, irrespective of the distribution of blood flow. We talked about oxygen consumption. Under resting conditions with normal distribution of cardiac output, the delivered oxygen is more than adequate to meet your VO2 needs. So you can always, under normal conditions, supply your tissues with more oxygen than it needs to create the amount of ATP that you need. Okay? Now, what do we do with all that extra oxygen that we're not using? Well, it circles back around in the body and it's residual and it's used in the next cycle. All right, so when we do this, we want the remainder of oxygen that we're not using to be around 70%. So we use about 30% of that. All right, so I'm gonna just try to explain this graphically. Now, blood goes round and round and round, right? It goes through the tissues, it's utilized, it comes back, it gets reoxygenated, it goes around. Well, once it's used up, boom, 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 it comes back here, and right here, before it goes back into the right atrium, we want it to be at least 70%, okay? With that 70% remainder, 75% remainder, we can put it back into the lungs, oxygenate it, and it will come out at 99%, all right? So the oxygen level goes up, okay? Now, comes out 97%. When it goes through the brain, it goes from 97 down to 69. The brain uses a lot of oxygen, all right? And when it goes out to the other tissues, it's about 97%, all right? So as it crosses the liver, it drops from 97 to 66. As it goes across the gut, it goes from 97 to 66. It goes across the kidneys, it goes from 97 to 92. As it goes across the muscles and the soft tissues, it goes from 97 to 71. Skin, 97 to 88, all right? We add up these remainders that's left over and we bring them back up. It's about 70, 75%. We need that 70 to 75% because if we pump in 40%, is this gonna come out at 99? No, it's gonna be much lower. Then we cycle it back through. Next time it's gonna come back at 30%. It's gonna come out here, it's gonna be even lower. So we need that remainder to come back in to power what's going on for the rest of the trips around. Does that make sense? Okay. If your patient is in shock and they have a low volume of oxygen, the residual here, which is called the SVO2, which muscle in the body is burning up the most oxygen of everything? Nope. You might have a muscle in your head. No. Keep guessing. No. Your skin it cuts off the blood supply to your skin and starts to shunt it to your core. What muscle in your body do you think is working the hardest when you're in shock and you need to? Your diaphragm. Your diaphragm consumes more oxygen than any other muscle in your body when you're under stress. So that's one thing we can do. A technique that we can use is if a patient is under stress, they're breathing fast and they're burning up all their oxygen and we can't get this residual volume to go up, we can paralyze and intubate them, right? And then we take the workload off their diaphragm, we just increased our residual volume, right? You have to balance that with the fact that you don't want to crush their preload, and intubating a sick patient is very, very dangerous and we should probably not be doing it as often as we do. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. All right, next concept, we're going to put this into play. Now, the ability to deliver oxygen. As I said, if we can deliver a lot of oxygen to those tissues, and under normal circumstances, we have more than enough oxygen to meet our VO2, our consumption, all right? And therefore, we can just stay in aerobic metabolism, right? We don't have to use anaerobic metabolism. What's a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism? Lactic acid. Acid being the key word, all right? And we can measure that. All right. So if we have plenty of oxygen, we're not under stress, our lactate levels are very low, all right? Now, as we decrease our ability, think about the red and the blue slide, whatever things on that are perturbed. As we're decreasing our ability to deliver oxygen to the tissues, we need to extract more oxygen from our bloodstream. That residual volume, that 70%, is going down. This is that 70%, this is that residual volume. So as we're pulling more oxygen out of our tissues with each pass, the SVO2 is going down, all right? As less, we get to this certain point called the delivered oxygen critical value. At this point, we can no longer supply enough oxygen to our tissues to meet our VO2 demands, our ability to create ATP. And then we have to drop off because our oxygen extraction ratio is doing everything it can to pull all the oxygen out of the tissues. We have our residual volume is going down, down, down. We transition to anaerobic metabolism. And what happens here? Our lactic acid starts to go up, and our ability to create ATP for the things that keep us warm, that keep our reactions going, their ability to clot our blood is going down, 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 right? And the further we get over here. This is where you're in shock, okay? This is shock over here. We're no longer able to supply enough oxygen to our tissues. Does this make sense? Okay. Now, when we're in this phase over here, when we're in shock, we are experiencing something called oxygen deficit. And oxygen deficit is a value in an immediate point in time. So if I go to the casino, I roll up to the Emerald Queen Casino and I'm having a bad day and I'm losing $50 every minute, right? $50 every minute is my deficit. Now, after 10 minutes, what's going to be happening? I'm going to be broke or broker, right? Okay, so that's my oxygen debt. So every minute that goes by, I could be losing $50, I could be losing $20, I could be losing $100. That's my deficit. The accumulation of that time, if I lose $20 one minute, $100 the next minute, $50 the next minute, whatever that adds up to over however many minutes I'm in the casino, that's my debt, all right? That's what I have to pay off. Okay, so that's the difference between deficit and debt. Well, you can create an oxygen deficit in your body. At any singular point in time, we don't have enough oxygen to supply our tissues, and the longer that time period goes on, we accumulate debt, okay? Everybody tracking? Oxygen debt is the only physiologic indicator that has been clearly linked to both morbidity and mortality in the form of multi-organ failure after shock. So oxygen debt, the amount of time that you're without oxygen for all the reasons that we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes, is what kills trauma patients, okay? Does that make sense? And we can measure that. Oxygen debt is the only physiologic indicator that shows what's going on. All right, so here's a graphic representation of oxygen debt over deficit and debt over time. So everything's going along fine. We have enough oxygen to meet our demands, and we're involved in a motor vehicle accident, and we get a crush injury to our liver and our spleen, and we have an extremity injury, and it's hemorrhaging, right? So we go into shock, all right? As you're going into shock, the shock is not that bad at first, but it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And each one of these slices is their deficit. And we're accumulating deficit, which is creating debt. It gets down, down, down here, and then you show up, you put a tourniquet on, you extricate them from the vehicle, and you start booking it to the hospital, right? Then we call this like the time the resuscitation starts. Am I out of the woods? Am I all better? Is the situation resolved? No, because presently we are correcting the problems, but we are still losing $100 a minute, $50 a minute, $20 a minute as time is going on. So as time is going on, even after we start the recovery, we're still in a losing battle. Does this make sense? Things are getting better, but we're still losing during that recovery phase. All right, and here's how it is. So in this first time period here, our oxygen deficit is 30 mLs a minute. All right? And for this amount of time, time one, we lose 359 mLs. Okay, that's our debt, deficit debt. Now in time two, which is a shorter period of time, we bump up to 48 mLs a minute that we're losing. And it didn't double, it almost tripled. In a very short period of time, it actually got worse because our deficit is worse. So the further down this are, the faster we get in trouble. Now, okay, we're here, we put on some tourniquets, we put pressure dressings, whatever you got, we start turning towards the hospital. We should be getting better. we're still in a losing battle. We're back to 30 mLs per minute, but now we've gone from 912 mLs debt to 1500 mLs debt. All right? And in this last time 4, we're like, okay, well, we're almost back to baseline. Even though we're not losing much, we have no oxygen deficit, our debt has gone up to almost 1900 mLs. So we're in deep kimchi here. Does this make sense? Okay. Oops. Right. So why is this important, and how does it relate to blood, and how does it relate to 11% increase in mortality for every minute that goes by? If you can, so these shock periods, A, B, and C, the shock period, the debt, everything is equivalent. Everyone see that? Okay. A has survival and no multi-organ dysfunction. B has survival with mild multi-organ dysfunction. And C has survival with severe multi-organ dysfunction, or they die. What is the difference between A, B, and C? The time it takes to get that oxygen debt recovered. The time it takes. So if we can get them very quickly better, so they're not losing as much blood and we don't go into that oxygen debt, A, B, or C, that is a significant difference in survival. This curve right here. All right? The faster we get them back, the faster they do. Because there's a period of time that you go into oxygen debt and you cannot get them back. All right? The muscle tissue, the organ tissue, the gut, it's too ischemic, it will never recover, and they'll die in the ICU in 2 days, 10 days, 30 days. All right? All right. This is the pre-hospital probability of death. So the higher you get to 1 is like 100% death. This is 0 death. All right. These are patients who received blood products. These are a matched group of patients, essentially the same, who did not receive blood products. So this is a 5% 24-hour mortality versus 11%, correction, 5% versus 19% 24-hour mortality, 11% versus 23% 30-day mortality. Okay? Now, this graph here, this is time in minutes, all right? And this is their survival probability. So if this is kind of the opposite. If it's down here, there's 0 chance they're going to survive. If they're up here, there's 100% chance they're going to survive, okay? Over time. So if a patient received a transfusion within 13 minutes of EMS arrival, and this is in Afghanistan, so that took a little while for the helicopter to get there, 34 minutes from the time of injury, this is their survival. If they did not receive blood products, this is their survival. A 20-fold difference, okay? Now, here's where it gets interesting, okay? This is the key to why I'm talking to you guys and not the trauma surgeons. If they did not receive the transfusion within 13 minutes, this is the survival for those that did not receive, and this is the survival for those that did receive. Question.
Just to be clear, that's 13 minutes after arrival.
Of EMS, yeah. 34 minutes from the time of injury, 13 minutes from the time of EMS arrival on scene. But remember, every 1 minute that goes by, which I'll show you in some other studies, is an 11% increase in mortality. Okay?
But many times we're there way sooner.
You think. Okay, yes, you are correct. But how many times do you think you get to the emergency department, they have blood waiting for you, and they rush them to trauma surgery and are giving them blood within 34 minutes of the time that they're injured?
Never.
Never. Because what happens when you roll in the door? The trauma surgeon's like, give your report, make it quick. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, anesthesiology, all these things, resuscitate, stop the bleeding. And they go, we need blood. Bobby, run to the blood bank and get me the blood. All right? And so they run away, and then they come back. And it just time, it's time. We can't beat that time. So This is why we got to do it, because if we don't do it, it's not going to get done. Furthermore, out of the 2 trauma centers in the county which we work in, how many of them have whole blood? Exactly 0. So,
Why not?
that's a great question, and we've been figuring that out for the last 5.5 years. The answer is it has to do with things that don't relate to patient care for the most part. It has to do with a lack of understanding of the importance. It has to do with a lack of, Shelley could probably tell us a lot about it.
Right now it's supply. They all want it really bad.
The trauma surgeons want it for sure. I went into a meeting in 2018 with the trauma surgeons like, we should have this. And the person who was running the blood bank at the time said, no way. I have to recruit people. I have to create computer programs. You have to do a different this, that, and the other. He's like, you just don't give enough blood. Anyways, it's a long and complicated story. Suffice to say that we have cracked the code on this, and since it doesn't matter if they have it or not, because it's too late, the trauma center is too late. The title of this talk should be, the trauma center is too late, right? And I'm not casting dispersions on anyone. I'm just saying that situationally, we're the ones that have to give it, so we're going to be the ones that are going to give it. All right? All good questions. All right. I'm just going to run through some studies here. This is a retrospective study that had 1,394 individuals with severe traumatic hemorrhage, which required activation of a massive transfusion protocol. Okay, we saw an inflection. So this is, so you go, so one of the conversations, I'll just back up a little bit here, give me time out. When I came home from Iraq in 2006, I went back to the trauma center and this guy's bleeding out in the trauma bay. And it was from his leg. So why don't you just throw a tourniquet on there? That's what we did over there. And they were like, what? You know, and there was all these things you've heard of, all the controversy about tourniquets over all the years. But what we found is that tourniquets are actually pretty safe. But the conversations we were having back then was, well, that's combat, Dr. Gates. That's not the same as in the civilian environment. Those are real talks, right? Like, how badly are they getting injured when it's different? Like, no, it's not different. So this study is from the American College of Surgeons. I showed you a study in Afghanistan that showed that. You're like, oh, well, that's Afghanistan. That's combat data. Surely that's different than what we're experiencing here. It is not, okay? From the trauma center, 1,300 patients from a trauma center from 2019 2020, we saw an inflection point at 14 minutes. So if you got blood up to 14 minutes after arrival, your survival was 96%. But if you got blood at 15 minutes, your chance of survival was 91%. It goes down with the passage of time. Why? The triangle, right? The accumulation of that oxygen debt. And the oxygen debt is the only physiologic indicator of multi-organ failure and all the things that die, for all the reasons that we've been talking about. So these are examples of how that science, the magic that I showed you, is actually plays out in patients. And here it says at the bottom, they also found that for survival in the first 4 hours, the secondary outcome, survival for 4 hours, every 1 minute increase in time to whole blood transfusion was associated with an increased risk of mortality. And this is why, right? This is the coagulation cascade, and I gave this at a pediatric talk, and I said, that's the coagulation cascade for an adult on the left, and that's a coagulation cascade for a child. All right, but people lose a lot of blood, all right? Okay, this, you go, oh yeah, they lose a lot of blood there when they get blown up and all these other things. This is a case that came out of Lakewood. Dr. Friedrich sent me this slide, I don't know how many years ago, but this gentleman took a piece of that bookcase or whatever it is, that piece of metal, and he cut himself on his neck. And that's how much blood he lost on the scene before the paramedics arrived, were able to get him resuscitated. So this, my point is, this happens here, this happens at home, this happens in our own backyard. So I was working in the emergency department just the other day, and I got a call. He said, hey, Dr. Gates, EMS on the phone, they need a time of death. It's for a trauma patient. I can't remember, there was something interesting about it or unique about it. So I got up and I walked over there and I said, hey, what's going on? And he said, well, we got a 23-year-old woman who's involved in a motor vehicle accident over here by the Dome. She's in PEA arrest, so we're calling you for a time of death, but we got her back, so we're taking her to the trauma center. What does that patient need? Blood, 100%. Did we have it? No. What was her ultimate outcome at the hospital? She died. Okay? All right. So this is an article that's in the Journal of Emergency Medical Services written by a guy named Ryan Garrett. He used to have this job at Tacoma before me. And it's called the trauma's lethal triad of hypothermia, acidosis, and coagulopathy create a deadly cycle for trauma patients. Despite great advancements in trauma care over the past 30 years, trauma is still the #1 leading cause of death in any age group, particularly for people from ages 1 to 44. Trauma is the #1 cause of death in the United States. Of these deaths, 40% is hemorrhage and remains as the leading preventable cause of death. So a preventable cause of death means that something that we could do or intervene on to prevent these people from dying. 40% of the leading cause of death in the United States is hemorrhage, and we can do something about it. So a variety of seemingly simple but truly significant actions and inactions by EMS, both at the scene and during transport, can directly prevent or slow the progression of the lethal triad. As time passes, the more time that goes on, the three arms of the triad become so tightly interwoven that it becomes nearly impossible to stop and reverse the cycle. Thus, EMS personnel on the front lines of our nation's trauma system have the real opportunity to improve the outcome for millions of people injured annually. 2014, okay? We've known this for a long time. This is what kills patients. And now you know why, right? Why is the acidosis important? Why is the hypothermia important? Why does that contribute to coagulopathy? And if coagulopathy is occurring, I can't clot my blood, I'm losing more blood, I'm becoming more acidotic and colder, it's a vicious cycle and they're gonna die. All right, that is all of these things that lead to blood failure. So we have to restore that. Just talking about our current resuscitation fluids, right? So we say, well, the lethal triad is, let's see, it's hypothermia, acidosis, and coagulopathy. And I know that because Dr. Gates has said that like 35 times this morning already. Normal saline has a pH of 5. Is that good? No. It has a warmth of room temperature. Okay. And how much clotting factors or augmentation to the coagulation cascade does it have? None. In fact, if we take the first two and we think about how enzymes work, we're actually decreasing our ability to clot. We are killing our patients with this fluid. Well, I always use lactated ringers in my trauma patients because it's a far better solution, right? You ever heard anyone say that before? LR is way better in trauma. I used to hear that shit in the 90s all the time. pH of 6.5, room temperature, no clotting factors. These are bags of acid, is what you should call them. Hand me a bag of acid, because that's what you're doing. All right. So, compared to those who received any type of blood products during their helicopter transport, each liter of crystalloid that was administered was associated with a 65% increase in 30-day mortality. We're doing it wrong, okay? And we've been doing it wrong for a long time. Okay, so if they receive blood, they have a better survival, okay? I think we're gonna just take a quick break here because we've been at it for an hour, and I'm gonna transition over to Dr. Williams, the trauma surgeon's talk. Full disclosure, I've seen his talk twice. I've never given his talk, so it should be fun to watch. All right, any questions on that right now? Okay. Take 10, we'll come back at 10 after. So we're going to talk about a case, we're going to talk about the background, we're going to talk about the history of transfusions and the rationale for massive transfusion protocols, and then a little bit on the Madigan massive transfusion protocol. Now, James Williams, whose talk this is, he's a trauma surgeon, works over at Madigan, and he's been participating with this. Also, you may notice there's some individuals in the back that are dressed in camouflage. I don't know if you can see them or not. Where are you guys? But these are our friends from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, and they give whole blood all the time, so they're going to give us our practical demonstration today. All right, so here's our case. A 21-year-old male is assaulted by an unknown assailant with a knife, multiple lacerations to his bilateral arms, initial vitals in the field, heart rate 135, blood pressure 84/60, respiratory rate is 30, and a large volume of blood noted on the scene. Of those vital signs, what can we say about this patient? Shock. It's shock index, right? That's too easy. All right, so what are our treatment options presently? Combat gauze, tourniquets, bags of acid, IV therapy. So what about blood? All right, there's two types of, if you go to the hospital and they're giving blood, right, what kind of blood products are they giving? They have component therapy, and that is components. They take the blood when you donate it, and they break it down into three products. They have plasma, they have red blood cells, and they have platelets. I'm just kind of thinking I should have showed the slide that shows the effectiveness and all that from my presentation. But so they did some studies, and they said, well, what is going to be the most important or best way to resuscitate patients? And they go, what's more important of those components? So they did this. They did a couple studies. One was called the PROMPT study. One was, there were a few studies done down in Houston. I think we get into that in a little bit. But suffice to say is that they're like 2 plasma to 1 red. Do we need platelets? How many platelets do we do? And so they developed all these different protocols. 2 to 1, 2 to 1 to 1, 1 to 2 to 2, 3 to 3 to 3, and 1 to 1 to 1. Which one do you think was the best? 1 plasma, 1 platelets, 1 red blood cells. Duh. Right? It's the same, it makes sense. Now, whole blood transfusion in the pre-hospital environment started with a little fire department called the West I-10 Fire Department down in Houston, Texas. A guy by the name of Eric Bank was working in proximity to John Holcomb. They had collaborated on some tourniquet research, given some classes and so forth. And they decided that they wanted to give whole blood in the pre-hospital environment. And it has blown out to all these programs all over the United States. So in 2018, Brett came to me and he said, listen, I'm in the Army. We carry blood on our backs. Why can't we give blood in Pierce County? I said, that's a great idea. This should be no problem. We'll get this knocked out in a couple weeks and it'll be done. And so many years later, we are still struggling to get this done. So we're really happy to push across the finish line. We had our protocol and our op plan submitted a couple weeks later, and then everyone in the nation has essentially passed us by. All right, so exsanguination is a leading cause of preventable death in trauma patients. It's a leading cause of death in the field, and shockingly, it's the leading cause of death in the operating rooms when they come up. 25 to 30% of trauma patients, when they arrive at the trauma center, are already coagulopathic on arrival. Their blood is not clotting properly. And a lot of trauma centers measure this by something called a TEG. You put some blood in this little machine and it pulls it apart and it measures the stickiness of the blood. And the stickiness of the blood is kind of an indicator. If it's really watery and there's no stickiness, then we know that they're coagulopathic. If it's very sticky and it's working well, then you can test for that. We talked about this. Hyperperfusion leads to acidosis and hypothermia. It comes from exposure. Civilian and military studies have shown a decreased mortality, decreased blood product usage with whole blood transfusions, and whole blood is super effective, right? I had the opportunity to go out to the Olympic National Forest with some soldiers from 1st Special Forces, and they wanted to learn how to set up rope systems to evacuate patients down high-angle terrain, so we helped them with that. And then they were doing some training, and they're going to do some whole blood training, much like you're going to do today. So we're under this tent, it's pouring rain. We show up, they show up. They rolled up in a box truck, like from Hertz, and they roll up the back. And it's a trauma resuscitation bay that they have set up in the back of this truck, right? They've got cots, they've got all their gear attached to the walls and all this stuff. So then the Special Forces medic, he's very nonchalant. He's like, okay, Private, come here. And he goes, have a seat in that chair. And he goes, okay, Private, come over here. He goes, I want you to start an IV on this guy. He goes, well, I never started an IV before, Sergeant. He goes, okay, we're going to figure that out. He goes, start poking around. So he's poking around this guy's arm, and finally he gets the IV, and the other guy is like, and he starts IV, so they tape it up, and he goes, all right, you, Private, come over here, start IV on his other arm. So the guy's like, I never started IV, Sergeant. He goes, you'll figure it out. So he goes over there, and he puts the IV in the other guy's arm. So now he's sitting there with 2 IVs. Then he walks up, this very sophisticated medical procedure. And he takes his bag, with a line attached to it, and he plugs it into the one, and he drops it in the dirt and like pulls out a lollipop. And he's sucking on a lollipop while this blood's flowing into the dirt in this bag, right? And the kid's like, and he starts turning green, and then he like slumps over, and he's like, ugh, and I'm standing over, I was like, what are we doing? And the guy's still on his lollipop, like, and he goes, he's all right. And so I was like, you okay, kid? And the guy's like completely out of it. So then he takes the bag off, the bag's full, it's got 500 mLs in it, switches it over to the other arm, hangs it on the tree, and squeezes the bag in, the guy goes, like reanimation, right? And I was like, that's a great class. Everyone should see this class because that's a demonstration of shock, right? Yeah, I can tell you what shock looks like, but until you've seen it. And then to see someone come straight out of shock is amazing. Well, what I understand about people who give blood products, and we give blood products in the hospital all the time, and you can see a magnificent difference in the way the patient looks before the blood and after the blood. And the whole blood is the same thing. So of course it's going to make a big difference. In surgery, they do what's called damage control surgery. They don't do a whole lot of repairs. They just go in and they basically pack the liver, they find the holes, they plug them up very quickly, and they close the patient up. Sometimes they leave the wounds open, and they just basically stop them, and then they keep them stable, and then they put them in the ICU. And they wait for that patient to get better and better and better until they have recovered enough. Then they go back and they do the definitive surgeries, which are much more complex and complicated. So that's what we're kind of just demonstrating, damage control resuscitation here. All right. So the history of blood transfusions in 1616, William Harvey, an Englishman, reported on a closed circulatory system. Most physicians at the time felt the lungs were responsible for moving blood around the body. In 1665, the first blood transfusion in animals took place. And so of note, the person who is the person who named the arterial circulation at the base of the brain, the Circle of Willis, after his teacher Thomas Willis, and also performed xenotransfusions with lambs into people. All right. So in 1665, Richard Lauer invented the syringe, and right after that, he performed the first animal-to-animal transfusion. In 1666, Jean-Baptiste Denis did a first animal-to-human transfusion. He transfused lamb blood. So one of the treatments for almost any kind of condition, any illness that you ever could have, was bloodletting. Basically, they had phlebotomists, so if you were ill, they'd come around to your house and they'd draw blood out of you. They were very respected in the community, these phlebotomists. They also used leech therapy. And so there was a boy, let's see, he was 15 years old. He had been bled with leeches 20 times, and he was deficient on blood. And this guy, Denis, thought it would be a good idea to take some lamb's blood and replace that blood. I don't know what these people were thinking back then. But he put a very small amount in the boy. The kid did not have a serious reaction. He went on, he got better, and so he was like, hey, let's try that again. So he had a guy with psychosis, okay, in case you don't know what that is, come on over to Good Sam and I'll show you, all right? But I'm sure all of you do because you're here in Pierce County. So he thought that adding some lamb's blood to this guy would be a good idea. Unfortunately, it went terribly wrong. The guy had a terrible reaction, and then he was put on trial. Ultimately, he was acquitted, but France outlawed blood transfusions entirely. And then in 1818, James Blundell did the first human-to-human transfusion, and I don't think that one went very well because the blood would clot, and also there's this thing called the ABO and RH types, right, which cause transfusion reactions. So they did a little bit more research and they figured out how to properly select donors and keep the blood from clotting. And they used sodium citrate to keep the blood from clotting. Unfortunately, when you put sodium citrate into blood, it binds up the calcium. So that's why the whole blood transfusion has a low calcium. And that's why we have to add calcium when we give our whole blood transfusions. But there's blood groups, all right? We have A, B, AB, and O. And each of the blood, I don't know if you can see this very well, but A has a little bit of antigen that's coming off the cell, right? off each red blood cell. It's of a particular type, A type. And they also have antibodies that recognize B type blood as foreign and will destroy B type blood. So that's A. B type blood has these B type antigens, and they have antibodies in their body that recognize A as foreign, that will attack and destroy the A cells. Group AB blood has both the A antigen and the B antigen, but no antibodies to kill off any other cells because it would attack and destroy itself, right? But if we take any of these bloods, if we take AB and put it into either one of these patients, their antibodies are going to attack it. They're going to have a terrible reaction. Their immune system's going to go off, and it's going to be bad. Group O type blood has no antigens on the surface. So we can take that O type blood and we can put it into these patients, and these antibodies have nothing to recognize, so they don't have a reaction. That's why O is a universal donor. However, O type blood has antibodies towards both A and B. So what are we going to be transfusing? Low titer O whole blood. What does a low titer mean? These are people who have very, very, very low levels of these antibodies, right? If it's a high titer O positive and we put it into somebody's body, the blood that we transfuse will attack their body and cause a reaction. O type blood that we're going to be transfusing has very low levels of antibody, so there's essentially no reaction. Does that make sense? So that's why we do O type blood. All right. In 1918, the first transfusion of stored blood. 1934, the first blood bank was created. So in World War I, the Brits were using crystalloids, but then they transfusioned whole blood. This guy, Lieutenant Bruce Robertson, set up something called the whole blood transfusion, and he figured out a way to pull blood out of patients, store it, cold store it, transport it to the battlefield, and administer it to patients there. And so they were having some really good successes during World War I, transfusing whole blood. In World War II, the Brits were using whole blood, and Americans thought it was logistically impossible to get whole blood from the States where all of our donors are, because we only want American blood, right? And then take it over to Europe and then give it to our patients, right? But what we were discovering is that a British patient would get injured, they get the whole blood, they do really well. An American patient would get injured, get component therapy or crystalloids, and do very poorly. So by the end of the war, we changed our strategy, and we were shipping over, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of units of blood, and I can't remember what the number is, but we switched over and we were actually doing whole blood in the war. In the beginning, we were doing plasma, at the end of the war, whole blood. Now, as with any war, the lessons of the war are immediately forgotten. Get rid of your recon, get rid of your snipers, get rid of all your assets, and then get out the parade uniforms. And then as soon as the war kicks off, you figure out very quickly that you need snipers, you need recon, and you don't need your parade uniforms. So there was no blood program for the first 70 days of the war. But by the end of the war, we were shipping over almost 500,000 units of whole blood in Korea. And they were using plastic bags to store them. In Vietnam, they were shipping 1.3 million units of whole blood to Vietnam for the patients. But about half of that was being wasted, okay? And then during Vietnam, packed red blood cells and the FFP became available. And they were using, it looks like 100,000 units of uncross-matched type O blood that were transfused. Oh, they also developed something called the walking blood bank. So the walking blood bank is, we're on a base, right? And there's a unit out, gets in trouble, they get a bunch of casualties, to bring them back. We've pre-identified people who can transfuse blood into particular types. So we say, hey, here come the casualties, and all the people that work there line up, and they give fresh, warm blood. You take it out of those patients, they check it real quick, and then they immediately transfuse it into the casualties, and the casualties do really well. All right. Yes, Brett has volunteered. What we're going to do is we're going to have what's called a whole blood boy. And right, they're going to sit in the back of your unit, and then you just sit in the back. All right. Okay, so how did we get to the point where we're using normal saline for all our resuscitation? In the 60s and the 70s, there was some science done, and they said, hey, listen, when things are really tight and you can't give whole blood, if whole blood's not available, we can use crystalloid solutions to temporize those patients to get them to a situation where they can get whole blood. They're not going to do as well, but they do better than patients that receive nothing. So we said, okay, well, if we can use it to temporize to get whole blood, somehow that transmuted into, let's just give normal saline and lactated ringers, and we'll wait till we get to the hospital. But we didn't understand all the things about oxygen debt and the things that go into that and how bad it got. So, and essentially, things went wrong. All right, so we talked a little bit about component therapy. We break these blood bags. You go in, you donate a unit of blood. Then you can use it, you can take the red blood cells, you can take the plasma, and you can take the platelets, but they all have to be stored in separate bags, and you have to have specific storage solutions to preserve them in each bag. So now we have 3 times or more solution added to those products that has nothing to do with resuscitation. So it increases the volume that we're giving, and it decreases the capacity or the effectiveness of the actual product. But in the majority of medicine, the rest of the house of medicine, we can give red blood cells to patients who are anemic, that are losing blood because they have menometrorrhagia, or cancer patients, or GI bleeds, and these other things. And if someone has a coagulopathy, for example, if they have a factor V deficiency, or they have hemophilia or something like that, we can give them plasma, which has all of the clotting factors in it. And we don't have to give them platelets and RBCs. And if they're low on platelets, they have something called thrombocytosis. Some people have autoimmune conditions where their body attacks their own platelets, and they have very low platelet counts. Cancer patients also have very low platelet counts. We can take the platelets and we can give them to that patient. So now we've helped 3 patients with 1 unit of blood, rather than just giving 1 whole unit of blood, whole unit of blood, whole unit of blood. And very importantly, we can charge 3 times for them. Okay. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier. There's been a lot of studies done to say, well, if we're giving all these crystalloid solutions to these patients, and they get to the operating room, they open them up, they're receiving 10, 16 units of normal, 10 or 16 units of liters of normal saline. Then they get to the operating room, they open them up, and the gut is so swollen with fluids that it bulges out like this, and they can't close the patient up. So they send them to the ICU, and over the course of weeks, they have a dressing over the gut, and they gradually apply more and more and more pressure, and they try to get that gut to close down and close it back up. Because if we close it up, then there would be so much water pressure in the abdomen that the blood can't get to the gut dies, and the patient dies, right? This was actually happening. And this was still going on in the 2000s. They have these big, what they call silos on their abdomen. So then they start thinking about a little bit more about what should we be just giving low volumes of blood. Again, bags of acid disrupting clot formation, not doing anything for the clotting cascade, causing them to be more acidotic and cold. The other thing is that when you put a large volume of fluid into a person, it goes to their lungs, all right, their lungs. The blood vessels that run along the outside of the alveoli, they have 1 cell on the outside of that blood vessel, all right? And then there's 1 cell along the lining of the alveoli. Why is that? So the gas can transport back and forth very readily. Well, if you fill that patient up with fluid, the water seeps into the alveoli, right? And then you get the lungs that are full of fluid. It's not doing anything for their oxygenation. They get what's called adult respiratory distress syndrome. And this has been killing patients for a long time as well. So there's a lot of dysfunction that happens with giving fluids into trauma patients. Why did he put that?
Yeah, that's just a lateral thought of me because there's so much fluid in them that they were having to relieve the obviously
Yeah, so, right. So a lateral canthotomy is performed in the emergency department when a patient gets facial trauma and they get a blood clot behind their eye. It pushes forward on the eyeball and it compresses the eye, causes such high pressures in the eyeball that we have to cut these two ligaments that hold the eyeball down. And we basically release it to come out in what's called proptosis. Then after we send them to Harborview, they evacuate the clot, they can push that thing back in there and repair the ligament and it goes back to normal. But if we don't do it very quickly, the eye will die, right? Well, apparently, I'm not super familiar with this, but there can be so much fluid in the body that causes the eye to swell. The pressures go so high that they have to do this lateral canthotomy. Have this bug-eyed patient in the ICU for a couple weeks while the fluids go away. There's a lot of bad shit that happens with that. So in Iraq and Afghanistan, they started to figure out, well, they're like, well, now we have science behind us. And Colonel Holcomb was behind a lot of this as well. And he's not the only one. Like there's a whole team of people at what's called the Army Institute for Surgical Research. And they spend their days just trying to figure out how to save soldiers in combat. And one of the big things that they study is hemorrhage. So in the beginning of the war, they're like, maybe if we just give this factor 7, right, we can help build clots. We'll give this factor 7. And it worked, but it also caused them to build clots in their legs and pulmonary embolisms and that. So factor 7 kind of fell by the wayside. And then they said, well, let's see if we can start giving blood. We've got these 3 components that we can give. Maybe we can give that stuff in the field. Which would be the best? Where does the factor 7 live? It lives in the plasma. Well, let's take plasma to the field and let's give plasma. So, okay, it's a volume expander. It's got a good pH. We can warm it up. And the patients did pretty well with that. But it has no oxygen carrying capacity. So like, well, let's throw some red blood. And that's where the science came behind, well, what should the ratio be? Do they need more plasma and a little bit of red blood cells? Do they need more red blood cells? Do they need some platelets as well? And they say, well, in a fresh trauma patient, they should have plenty of platelets. They're probably going to need these clotting factors. And then when you store red blood cells, the oxygen carrying capacity of that blood drops from 100% down to 20%. So giving red blood cells in a trauma patient, the color is the same, but it doesn't really work as well, okay? So they would say, maybe we need to give more red blood cells, some plasma, and sometimes we'll give platelets. So they came up with like a 1-to-1 ratio, plasma and red blood cells, 2-to-1 ratio, and all these ratios. And then that's when they came up with these studies where they started to realize that a high ratio of plasma to RBCs was good. They would give 1 unit of red blood cells to 1.4 units of plasma. And then they said, well, that's working a little bit. And then you can see Holcomb's on all these papers. They looked at 16 trauma centers in the United States. They took 467 massive transfusion patients, and they found that they had increased 30-day survival on patients who received 1 unit of red blood cells and 2 of plasma, and it goes on and on. Then there's these 2 trials called the PROMPT and the PROPER study. These are seminal studies because what they discovered after looking at like nearly 1,000 patients in 10 US trauma centers with all of these different protocols is that a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio was actually the best, all right? Shocking. I know that just blows your mind. Like nature knows better than us. Whoa, that's weird. And then they said, well, if we're just giving 1-to-1-to-1, maybe then they kind of look back at the history and said, well, we were giving whole blood in World War I. Why don't we just give whole blood now? It's easier to carry, it's easier to store, it's cheaper for all these reasons, and you don't have to have a separate solution for the storage of the red blood cells, the plasma, and the platelets, which by itself adds up to like 1.5 liters for all these massive transfusion protocols. This is something called Tactical Combat Casualty Care. It's a consortium of physicians and scientists from all the services, Air Force, Army, Marines, Navy, Coast Guard, and then they bring in expert civilians from all of the major resuscitation centers and all of the academic institutions. And they meet in these large rooms and they discuss all of these topics and they come up with protocols on how they're going to transfuse. Or correction, how they're going to manage trauma. When do you apply tourniquets? When do you give tranexamic acid? When do you do this? When do you do that? And they look at all the science and they come up with these protocols. And so they again, came up with a protocol. They looked at everything. And they said, well, if you can do anything, and it's your choice and you have the resources available, you want to give whole blood. If you can't give whole blood, but you have products available, 1 to 1 to 1 would be your next choice. If you can't do 1 to 1 to 1, then you should do plasma and red blood cells at a 1 to 1 ratio. And if you can't do that, then of all of the 3 products, plasma is the best. Okay. And then if that doesn't work, then give 500 cc's and put them out of their misery. Again, some of the same studies that we talked about before. This is a study looking at plasma. So the percentage of patients, plasma versus the standard of care, which is normal saline. The plasma patients are doing better. The thing that, I don't know, have you ever seen my talk on tourniquets? It's like, who are the patients that got a tourniquet? What's their survival? Who's the patients that didn't get a tourniquet that need it? What's their survival? These studies look very similar in their numbers because if you can keep the patient's blood in their body or give them blood that they need, they do really well. If you can't, they die. I mean, it's over and over again. Anyway, with that said, I think we'll stop there and we'll move on to the more interesting stuff, which is going to be the hands-on.
Yep.
Is that cool?
Go through some equipment, some other stuff first. So.
Yep. All right, that's it for me. What questions do you have? Yes, sir.
I'm going to ask again if I have volunteers who would like to volunteer. So we need to draw blood. If you guys don't volunteer, we'll volunteer ourselves. To pull off of you, and then you will get it back.
Your own blood.
Years today.
I did it last time. Super fun.
Yep.
So if you guys volunteer, I can give the class, and then we'll meet you guys out in this section after he's done talking about equipment. Then we'll get all the blood.
Let me just finish up real quick.
Okay.
All right, that's a lot of science, a lot of slides. I apologize for that last class. That was not my class. I'm not super familiar with it, so I had to read a lot of that. What questions do you guys have on any of the topics that I've talked about this morning?
If you have questions, come take this microphone and over here. Shoot if I don't.
Here you go. Yes, sir. Go ahead and ask it. You never know. So here's the thing, guys. If you're going to come up to me after this class and say, hey, Dr. Gates, I was thinking about this thing, say it now so that everyone gets the benefit of your question. All right? There's a lot. I mean, that's a lot of information. So shoot, whatever you got.
You mentioned that the red blood cell component was 20% or 25% effective with oxygen
Right.
transport. What's the whole blood?
It's like it's like 100%. I'm going to pull this slide up. It's just going to take me a second to do it while we talk. And I think it's an important one because it really demonstrates the difference between component therapy and, you say, well, Dr. Gates, why don't we just wait till we get him to the hospital? It'll probably be fine. They have blood products there. And we can be doing some other things while I pull this up.
Just in regards to storing it?
Yeah, it just loses its capacity as time goes on. God damn it.
Yeah, so.
Here we go.
Blood lasts a lot longer, and it's like with its all of its capacity. So there's platelets and body factors, oxygen bearing fat, turn on. Yep. So yeah, that's one of the major benefits of whole blood versus component therapy. When they go through the process of spinning it down, separating everything, it does some damage to it. Whole blood just stores better. You're leaving it in a natural state, right? And it lasts a lot longer. So we have a shelf life of 21 days on this. By the time we get it, it'll probably be 18 to 19 days, roughly, by the time we get it. It goes through the blood bank and multi-care. And I don't remember all the numbers, but by the time you hit that 21-day mark, it's still better than component therapy. So, I mean, it does degrade over time. About 14-day mark, it starts to kind of fall off the chart a little bit, but it's still better than what we're doing currently. So.
All right, let's see if I can find this slide. See, it was a good question. It was Mike Worthy. Yeah, totally.
Come and take it.
Well, it's coming from you, Jim.
Don't worry, I'll make a select. Dr. Gates, you talked about whole blood transfusion. Before I ask you, button, hold on, is it red or green? Technology. Yeah, there you go.
Test. Dr. Gates, you talked about blood transfusion. What about TXA? In my background, I come from 160th, and I'm currently in the National Guard, so I'm not super privy on EMS. Is TXA used frequently in EMS?
We use it a lot, especially with this. Our protocol was once written for 1 gram of tranexamic acid, and then the 2nd gram of tranexamic acid was supposed to be given in the trauma center after arrival in the form of a drip. The trauma surgeons, it has been shown that giving 2 grams up front is far more effective, and the trauma surgeons actually came to us and said, listen, can you guys just give both the 2 grams because we always forget to give it. So we're giving 2 grams of tranexamic acid. That's going to be a protocol modification for us.
Yeah, so if you guys, I don't know how many of you have read the protocol yet, but it says 1 gram in there currently, right? And so basically right now, I'll talk about a little bit more is that when you make that phone call, hey, just tell them you want to give the 2nd gram or ask to give it, and just give it up front, right? Because we are going to update our protocol to reflect current best practices. This protocol was written, 5.5 years ago? And so it's a little bit out of date.
And then, as you may know, the reason we're asking you to make that call before giving that 2nd gram of tranexamic acid, like if you call me at Good Sam, and honest to God, if you put my name in the chart and just do it, I don't care. I'm a base station physician. It's fine. But, hey, that's on camera.
Open protocol, basically.
But here's the thing, like there's no downside to it. It's safe. Your patient's already getting whole blood anyway, so it's totally indicated. The protocol, the biggest problem in our county is protocol modification. So I can write that protocol today, and it will take, I don't know, anywhere from 6 months to 3 years for it to become part of your practice. And that's not what's best for the patient. So let's go back to that. Let's go back to that question here. So hemoglobin, which is the ability to transport oxygen, the concentration of hemoglobin, right? So me standing here, I've got a hemoglobin of about 15, all right? The average patient at Good Sam probably has a hemoglobin of about 12. That's just the population. So in whole blood, the hemoglobin, the ability, remember the slide, the blue and red slide, the hemoglobin is about 12 to 13. In red blood cells, component therapy, it's 9. So it's dramatically reduced. We transfuse patients in the hospital when their hemoglobin is 7. So that blood that we're giving them is already very anemic. And that's because of the storage process and the splitting up process. The hematocrit is simply 3 times the hemoglobin, right? So it's redundant to say that. Platelets. So platelets are what causes clots. In whole blood, platelets are 138 to 165. Once it's split up and you give just platelets, it's 90 to 120. So again, a dramatic reduction just from splitting those blood components up and storing them differently. The platelets they're not as many. Okay, this is very important. Fibrinogen, if you were paying close attention to that coagulation cascade slide, one of the things that's very important within the coagulation cascade is fibrinogen, and each of those blocks is a factor, right? So all of those factors that contribute to the coagulation cascade are carried in the plasma. All right, for whole blood, they're normal at baseline for factor 8 and greater than 50% at day 7. So they're going to degrade over time, but in whole blood, they're at 50% at day 7. When we break up plasma, it's 62% dilution at baseline, and we lose the factor 8. So one of those factor 8s in fresh plasma is actually not there. So it's not as effective as whole blood. And that may be because of the preservative, or it may be because of the process. I don't know. So the clotting, that tag, that stickiness of the blood, and how that machine where we can measure it. So the tag of whole blood is nearly normal at 21 days. I'll say that again. The stickiness of the blood, its ability to clot for whole blood is nearly normal at 21 days. And in component therapy, it's pretty dramatically reduced right off the bat, and it gets worse over time. Platelet aggregation is greater than 50% in whole blood at day 7 to 10. And in whole blood or component therapy, the 1-to-1-to-1 ratio, when we separate them and put them back together, there's nearly a complete loss at day 5 of platelet aggregation. Right? So we're rushing them to the trauma center to give them component therapy. That's what we're doing right now. That's our best case scenario. And then for practical aspects, if you're going to give 4 liters of blood resuscitation, which is a massive transfusion protocol, for the whole blood, it's 8 bags because they're 500 mLs each, and it's 1 storage mode. For component therapy, it would be 13 bags and 3 different storage modes. All right, this you would give 4,000 mLs, and this you give like 4,100 mLs. So 6 to 6 to 1. Does that make sense? Cool. So great question. Whole blood is far more effective than component therapy in itself.
Yeah, just so you guys are aware right now that when we start this, we're gonna kind of have the cart before the horse. Like the trauma hospitals aren't gonna be carrying whole blood yet. So don't be surprised if you bring a patient in, you've given 1 unit, that they ask you to just keep, put that second unit on and give it, all right? Because it's gonna take them, and Shelley can touch on it a little bit later, it's gonna take them 15, 20 minutes if they haven't gotten the stuff out and rolling yet, so. Yep, yeah, so just be prepared. If you've only given a single unit, it's highly likely we'll be asked to give that second.
This is what's called abdominal compartment syndrome, or resuscitate with fluids. This belly is tense, ding, 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 like a watermelon, right? And when you lay them open, this is what the gut does. You see how swollen that gut is? It just blossoms out of the abdominal wall, and you can't shove it back in there. So they sit in the ICU for weeks like this, waiting for that to go down so they can put it back inside.
Scott, did you have a question?
Yeah, you showed a slide where the blood, as it goes through the body, 69% after it goes over the brain.
Right.
That one. Is there an advantage to giving arterial blood so that oxygen is higher in the blood that we're giving them? Does that make sense or not?
Yeah, it makes total sense.
Or does it not work that way? And
No, I think the problem is that getting into the arterial system is a bit more complex than getting into the venous system. For transfusion. So let me make sure I understand your question correctly. You're saying is it better to just give our blood transfusion on this side rather than on this side?
You're talking about donating on the arterial side.
Oh,
Yeah.
donate,
They
to donate.
They don't
No,
do donations on that side.
it's already been.
You're gonna have consumption during storage.
Yeah,
You're gonna have
I was gonna say.
Consumption during the initial portion of storage. So
Yeah.
Once you're providing that blood back, there is no inherent bound oxygen in hemoglobin. As you're providing it back, there may be some diffused oxygen within the plasma that is still present.
Yeah.
But as a whole, there's consumption in that storage process. And then once you give it back, it needs to go back across the membrane to have that oxygen transition back into the diffusion of the hemoglobin and the diffused oxygen within the bloodstream.
Yeah. So you're suggesting it would be primed already, just give it straight back, it'd be great. Yeah, no, it does. Yeah. Dave answered the question very well.
Plus, I don't want to give,
I have a hand left.
yeah, I don't want an arterial donation. Doesn't sound like fun.
All right, what else? What other questions? These are all great questions. Okay, with that said, I'm done.
On to the next. All right.
Brad, you gonna jump right in, or you gonna give him a break?
You want to do 5?
Your call.
This will take about 10, 15 minutes, so let's just keep rolling. Everyone good? All right, so the fun stuff, documentation, equipment. All right, how we got into this, as you guys know, like all 3 of these guys up here were classmates of mine, going through the Special Forces Medic course. Within a year getting out, 2 on the right, Timothy Pageant, Nate Winder, died. He died of wounds. He died during surgery. And, at that time, when we completed this course, like, we were real hesitant and not very aggressive with doing whole blood. We were taught it. This is 06, 07 timeframe, right? I mean, literally when I was going through the course, one of my instructors one day said, hey, my buddy of mine's making these in the garage. You guys want to test drive them? We were making our own tourniquets. Handed me a cat tourniquet. So, to try out. But, so we weren't aggressive at that point in time in doing transfusions. Like, we were taught how to do them, but we didn't realize how profound that impact was, right? So you move, a few years later, 2010, we were doing the walking blood banks. Those were pretty common then. So my buddy John steps on an IED, loses 3 limbs. He gets blood early on in the field, in the medevac helicopter, and survives, right? Like these 2 friends of mine on the right, they both bled out. They, they were in a period of shock for too long to recover. By the time they started getting blood, it was too late, right? So that's why I'm so passionate about this. So, and John's alive and well today, doing great. Matter of fact, Shelly, I found out, took care of him in the ICU in Germany. So kind of a small world, right? So with that, I'm gonna hit on this. Be good at the basics. Like if we can save red blood cells first and not have to do a transfusion, that's like #1 goal, right? So getting out there, doing things like stop the bleed, like was talked about in the other campaign, training law enforcement, making sure we're good at it, stopping blood loss early is important. And then if we can't, obviously replace lost blood. And then another thing we don't do very well across the board, this is nationwide, like we don't do a good job of actively warming our patients. So it's something you guys need to think about. And we actually are correcting that. With this initiative, we're gonna be putting the hypothermia management kits on each medic unit to start, and then eventually they'll be on. So sometime in January, you're gonna see those. Brendan and I are working on ordering those right now. So the equipment we're gonna carry. This is a list of it. I'll go through it each individually. It's starting to trickle in. We've got the coolers, which are up here in front of you. The warmers, unfortunately, are on back order right now. And when we start this program, we may or may not have them. So we can give it cold. Those 400,000 units of blood that were transfused in Korea were transfused cold. None of them were warmed, all right? So it's not best practice, but it's something that can be done. Ultimately, we wanna warm the blood as it's going in. So this cooler here is the Delta Ice. It's these blue ones you'll see up here. This is what Central Pierce is gonna be using. Tacoma also has one, but they're gonna be using this unit as their primary one. So there's a plate that's pulled out, comes out of them. That gets conditioned in a freezer for 12 to 24 hours and then gets put in there. There's a little process, but this is what we're gonna be using. This is a actual blood refrigerator. So it's got its own power. There's no plate, stays in it. That's the APRU. And there's a monitoring app that goes with it called BloodCom. If you're an MSO, you're gonna get very familiar with this. So I won't dive into the details with you guys, but it tracks the temperature, alerts us when stuff's going out of temperature. It's Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, both these systems have it. And it's part of like why these things are so expensive, right? Obviously, this APRU, just so you guys know, is about $12,000. These are $4,000 a piece. So just be careful when you're handling them. They are made for the field. What's that? Yeah, don't leave them on scene. The quantum warmer. So there's a few different warmers out there. This is what we're gonna be going with. And it may not warm blood as fast as we want. It warms at about 100 cc's a minute, but it's logistically the easiest thing to use, all right? The tubing is where it's warmed, right? This would be, your blood would be hanging up here, and this battery just hangs with the blood, right? So it's really logistically easy. Some of the other warmers out there are not so easy to use. Like you got this big warmer, it's gotta be within 18 inches of a foot of where the IV is inserted, and they're a pain to manage in the field. So you guys will go through that when you're a little bit more in the hands-on portion of it. But we're gonna have a backup system. Again, this is more MSO specific. And then we'll also have backup filter tubing. So blood has to flow through filter tubing, just in case there are any clots in it. It was 170 to 200 microns roughly. I think ours are all 170 micron filters. So we'll be using those. We'll have a backup tubing in case there's a failure with this. And then the hypothermia equipment. This is what we're gonna be just getting added to our medic units to start. And we'll get some classes on that later. So Our daily documentation, there's gonna be a daily process with this for the MSOs or any of you that might be acting as an MSO. Basically, we'll change those plates out every 24 hours. They're good for up to 48 hours. Since we work 24-hour shifts, it's easy just to establish that. Make sure that routine of every 24 hours you change it. So these plates that are in here, there'll be a freezer at 6.2. They'll have an extra one of those in it. You pull it out, let it come up to temperature, and switch the blood out, and then make sure everything's staying within temperature. So some daily checks, checking the warmers, standard stuff that we do every day at shift change, right? Checking our equipment. So, and it'll have to be documented. So we're gonna use PS Tracks initially, so you're aware. You'll see that when you're logging into your NARCs and doing that, there'll be a thing there for blood. If you're on that rig, you're checking the blood, and it's just verifying that you check all the numbers, make sure that the correct units of blood are in there, and that it stayed within temperature, and you did the change out of the plate, and you check the warmers. So we'll have a paper backup in case of some sort of failure, and then eventually that BloodCom app, we're hoping to run everything through one app. That way, it's Tacoma and Central Pierce are doing the same thing. When Multicare is looking at the data, because eventually we're going to be able to give the blood back to them. Like right now, we can't because they don't use whole blood in the hospital. Their goal, though, is within a year, I believe, they want to see whole blood being delivered in the hospital. So at some point, if we don't use it in that 21 day, we'll have probably within 7 to 10 days of getting the blood. If we haven't used it, we'll turn it back in, get another batch, and we'll just so we're reducing waste. And we just want to make everything easier. We've got to, keep, everything, cross the T's, dot the I's, right? Because with blood, if there's anything wrong, they're not going to take it back. And it puts us in a potential liability situation. So transfusion record, this is going to get filled out with it's going to be a triplicate form. Can pass these around. And those will get filled out with every patient. And it's going to be, right now, the MSOs are going to make sure that gets done. You've got to put the stickers that are on the blood bag. They need one sticker needs to go on each copy of that. Can't stress that enough, all right? You're going to have to pull that triplicate form apart and put those stickers there. And then we're going to keep the white copy. Yellow and pink will go to the charge nurse, and then they'll get the other copy off of the lab. And then we're going to have a bunch of stuff in ESO that you're going to have to do. I think next slide. So one, you'll need to make sure that you're getting, if it's a pediatric patient, you're getting the doc signature that gave you the order, right? The transfusion records filled out and uploaded for right now. I think we're gonna have to send it back to the EMS division so we can get that figured out 100%, but EMS division will upload it currently. At some point, you'll be able to take a picture of it, upload it into ESO. And then making sure that blood products record is checked, all right? Because that's gonna trigger a couple things. It'll trigger the CQI, because 100% of these need to get, at least for the first couple years, we're gonna review 100% of these reports. They're gonna get looked at by our doc. And then we also need to make sure that ALS2 is checked. There's a significant cost with this, right? We're paying $800 per unit. So every time we go to the blood bank to put blood in this cooler, it's a $1,600 charge, right? And so we need to make sure that we're trying to recoup that. Because if we're just doing the basic math, we're giving this every 7 days, once a week, 52 times a year, that's $84,000 of blood, right? So if we're using 2 units every time, it's a significant amount of money, all right? So we need to make sure we're trying to recruit some of that. ALS2 is going to be legal as of January 1. We can charge ALS2 for that. So make sure it's checked. And then just so you guys are aware that the way that the law is written for us to give blood, a physician has to order it. It can be ordered after the fact. So Friedrich, Gates, Dr. O'Mahony, they're going to be going in after the fact and signing these orders, every single patient, all right? So that's why, pediatric patients, we're going to make that attempt to when you make that base station phone call, because you have to get authorization to give it to PEDS, is having that doc that gave the authorization sign that in ESO when you're in the emergency room, all right? So if it doesn't happen, Dr. O'Mahony will sign it, but just that's going to be added to ESO, so be looking for it. All right, so right now, Pierce County blood receiving facilities, these are the hospitals that you can take patients to that are receiving blood. Don't take them to any other hospitals, all right? Because they're the ones that are trained to deal with whole blood. The system's set up. It may expand at some point, but right now, this is it, all right? And actually, we haven't talked, you can probably go up to Harborview. We haven't really had that discussion. You should be able to. They'll get the information to Harborview, but right now, obviously, like these facilities. So if we're giving blood, we should be going somewhere closer, so. Yep. Oh yeah, and Harborview was actually going to be our transfusion service initially, and so they're well aware that we're doing this, but there's just some stuff on the lab side that they need to be able to have access to. That's why these facilities are, these are the 4 facilities, so, or 5. All right, so I'll just touch on this real quick, is Jehovah's Witness, all right? Obviously, as you guys may or may not know, they believe that they can't have blood transfusions, right? So there was a meeting a couple weeks ago where some of the members involved in this program sat down with leaders in the Jehovah's Witness community, just made them aware of it, and they said, hey, look, do your best to identify us. Like, they should have this in their wallet. I know we don't always look at it, and they understand that. If you see this in their wallet, they're told to put this in front of their ID, all right? So that's, and Katie, none of them are using bracelets, or there are some out there, right?
That's an individual's choice, but that's
Okay.
not something they advocate for. You just totally get this card.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's nice about this card is on the back side of it has all of their like significant medical history, meds,
Yep.
anything else that you might want to be aware of. So they were they just asked that we do our due diligence.
Mhm.
If for some reason we miss it and we give a transfusion field, they understand that we are
Yep.
that's going to happen.
Yes. Yeah, so like she said, they're pretty understanding that we may give them blood. We may not see this, or they may not have it on them. They understand that. It's just, we're going to do our due diligence to look for it. We all know how those situations transpire that we're on. Like, a lot of times, it's the last thing we're looking for. So if you happen to see this, someone shows it to you, don't give them blood, all right? So, all right. All right, so donor program. Eventually, we will have a donor program with this at some point. So that's been, when this started, we were with another vendor that was going to provide us the blood, and we had this thing all set up. You guys might remember I did a blood drive back in 2021 with Tacoma and Central Pierce. It was super successful, but at some point we're going to start identifying people in our community and amongst our group have O blood type and then a low titer, and hopefully do some blood drives with them. So right now, when we have these blood drives, let's make an active effort to participate in them, and go in there and tell them you want, if you're an O blood type, tell them you'd like to participate in as an O donor for whole blood, and maybe get you in the registry, because they do have a separate program, BloodWorks Northwest does right now. So the more that we can add to that, as we prove that we're going to need more of these units or resources in the county, it's going to allow them to give us more blood when we ask for it. Because right now we're starting with Tacoma EMS 1 and then MSO 6-2, and that's a huge area. Like, obviously we're starting with our own districts, but at some point we're going to open it up to everyone, and the program's going to have to expand, right? So yes, Katie.
One thing I didn't know, guys, if we're going to give blood, let's do BloodWorks Northwest. That's
Yep.
the only blood bank that supplies our county's hospitals. So if you would donate, like, we did a big drive in Tacoma with Red Cross, and apparently all that blood went to Portland.
Yeah.
We're going to donate, like,
Yeah, so BloodWorks, like she says, the sole vendor for the Pacific Northwest now, like north of Oregon. Like, literally Red Cross, they might do blood drives up here, but it all goes south right now. So BloodWorks Northwest, I know that our public relations side, they have relationships with BloodWorks Northwest. So pay attention to those. I'm going to start kind of jump on the bandwagon and trying to get us involved in donating. So, All right. Again, just to reiterate, be good at the basics, learn how to stop bleeding, and use this blood, right? Let's be aggressive with it, and actively treat hypothermia. Can't stress that enough. So our protocols, guys, are, when you compare them, I know Shelly will touch on this a little bit, across the nation, ours are probably more aggressive right now than a lot of others as far as when to give blood. Like recognizing we need to give it early. A lot, like I think King County, unless they've changed it, like they have to wait until that patient has a blood pressure of 70, right? Our guidelines more or less mirror TCCC guidelines. So it's relatively aggressive, but that creates some contradictions in the protocol right now that we recognize and are planning on changing. But like Dr. Gates was saying, that process is cumbersome, takes a long time to make those changes. So one of the contradictions in there is permissive hypotension. Like, when do we want to use permissive hypotension? When's kind of our guideline for that? No, it's more like we have clear fluids. I don't have blood on scene, right? Like, we don't want to get their blood pressure skyrocketing. We don't want to blow clots out. But at the same time, we want to resuscitate them to like a level of consciousness, getting a radial pulse back. You know, watching that mean arterial pressure get, you know, but what's a good mean arterial pressure? When is someone perfusing? 65, right? So getting in that range, like resuscitating hemostatically and to a guideline where they're actually responding to it, and not necessarily getting the pressure skyrocketing, but also a pressure that perfuses. All right, so those are some changes we're gonna make. Just be aware of that. Like, you're not gonna get, because right now it says to resuscitate in the protocol to a pressure of 80 to 90, but that's when we can give blood, right? So you see the contradiction there. So it was a conversation years ago with some docs, and we knew that we had to tackle this later. We got this in the protocol and moving, and that's why it's written that way. It was so. All right. Any questions on that? We move on. All right. That's it. So, all right. Shelly, actually, you're up. Yep. And then, do you want to get the donors?
Yeah, if I get donors, we'll open the door so you can hear Shelly talking at the same time, and that way we can start.
All right, let's do a 5-minute break, and be back in 5.
All right, hi everybody, I'm Shelly. I work at TG. I'm one of the trauma coordinators. My background is ER, ICU nursing. I did flight for a while when I was in the military, and I was overseas taking care of people in OEF, OIF. So I have tried to kind of help be a little bit of a go-between between the blood bank nerds, and I'm gonna just call them that, and then you guys. So I have helped. I'm gonna try to simplify this form, like what has to happen with this form, because we have to make the blood bank mafia happy or this goes away, okay? That's just the simple fact of it. They're like the DEA of the blood world. And nobody hates them more than ER nurses, so. Anyway, so this form, there's a couple additions to this, but for the most part, it's the same. There is a little notation on each of these spots where you put for each unit. It's gonna say, make sure you put this on every single page. So it's gonna be 3 pages, like back in the day we had like the triplicate form and it would go through with carbon copy. It's gonna be like that. This portion is EMS fill out portion. And I think this will be MSO for the most part, is that right?
For right now, yes, it'll be MSO.
Okay,
Let me,
Is the
Yeah.
MSO gonna go with you to the hospital?
yes. So right now, MSO is going to ride with you in the hospital. We're gonna get in with this equipment and roll with it. We'll kind of hang the blood. And just while we're touching on this form, it says plasma and RBC up there. That's a backup. I forgot to mention that earlier. The way it's working right now, our blood will come in every Thursday, and if we use it between then, and it's not sitting there waiting for us, we're gonna backup plan, use red blood cells and plasma, so.
which honestly is still, like they're still having good outcomes with that. So it's better than crystalloid. But it needed to be written like that so that there's a, contingency plan. Okay, so this is like my chicken scratch filled out. Name at the top. There's going to be a spot for sticker. You can just put the patient sticker on, even if it's a DOE chart or alias chart, it can all get merged on the back end. Or a picture taken when that functionality comes into play. This spot at the bottom, you'll sign, and then this is where everything will go at the bottom. White goes back with you, yellow and pink stay with the hospital, and then the nurse will make sure that this portion for the blood bank goes to the blood bank. This is all very regulated, so there may be, if any pieces are lost, this is going to have to kind of be reconciled because every unit has to have like full 100% accountability at any given time, really. So this part, whoops, take with you, and this is the portion that make the nurse sign it, okay? And I will be bird dogging that on this end, so. Okay, just a couple cases. I know we don't have a lot of time. Let me just skip to Central Pierce.
Yeah,
Let me just skip to the.
we're good on time.
Okay. All right, so classes of shock. I know this is a little bit redundant, so I'm just gonna be brief. But you can lose a lot of blood and not have a lot of change physiologically. So you can lose 1.5 liters and not have a change in your blood pressure. And so that's why there is more components now built into the protocol where you can take into consideration heart rate and pulse pressure, things like that, where it's physiologically you know that this person is hemorrhaging and you need to do something, but you don't necessarily have, like, for instance, a systolic of less than 70, like some of these protocols are. So blood pressure, class 3 shock is when you start seeing decrease in blood pressure. That's pretty late in the game. Pulse pressure starts early on, and that's where your systolic and your diastolic start narrowing because your body is clamping down, trying to kind of augment that preload. Heart rate is earlier than blood pressure typically. If the patient's not beta blocked, they don't have any other issues going on, or it's going to affect their heart rate, like a AICD or something. And then GCS is also pretty late. So, and sometimes it's not helpful anyway because our patients have other trauma going on other than hemorrhaging. So early on, these patients in class 2 shock with minimal signs physiologically may still need blood. And that's where we just wanted to emphasize, look at the whole patient and not just blood pressure. Okay, these are various protocols around the country. Here's San Antonio Fire. They use a pretty low systolic in isolation, but then they use shock index there, with the heart rate component, and then in tidal. Here's New Orleans Fire. New Orleans is giving mostly cold products, and they're giving component therapy, and they're still seeing mortality benefit. Here's Tidewater County, Florida. Here's Palm Beach County, Florida. They're all similar. This is Maryland EMS. Maryland has a similar protocol to ours, and theirs is pretty meticulous. I like it. I've sent everything to Katie that I had from Maryland. And this is ours. So here's adult and then peds. So you have some ability to kind of like use vital signs and your exam in this protocol, which is, in my opinion, the way it should be. All right, so some case files here. These are some Tacoma case files. I'll just there's a couple of these that are really good, backing up Dr. Gates' points. So I'm just gonna skip, sorry, to, this is a spine case that, just a key point on spine injury in hemorrhagic shock. This subset of the population has been shown to not be given blood typically because of their presentation. They're typically warm because of their neurogenic shock component. They're bradycardic, but they're also hypotensive. And we do tend to fixate on their neurogenic shock and then forget that they also may have like a grade 5 spleen that they're hemorrhaging from. So in the Texas data, they have noted that this population needs to be targeted for transfusion early. Just something to keep in the back of your mind. We obviously don't have any data because we're just starting out, but we can learn from other people. Okay, so this case, just because Dr. Gates talked about like point of injury being like when the clock starts, I just wanted to mention this case because it highlights how long it takes us to give blood in the hospital. So this was a case back in March. This was actually a POV arrival to TG ambulance bay. She had been shot by her boyfriend at an apartment complex just like right down the street. TFD was staging for PD, and they didn't actually get the go-ahead prior to her dad leaving with the patient, leaving the scene. And TPD followed them up into our ambulance bay, and then like on the radio, we're like, oh, they're at TG now. And Key Peninsula Fire was leaving, and they noticed them and kind of like helped her into the hospital. So she was awake on arrival, but quickly decompensated, and she had one GSW to the umbilicus area. She went, she like coded on arrival essentially. So this is the yellow is where the injury occurred, or where the scene was, and then here's TG up here at the top. So it was quick, like she got there quickly by her dad, but then it still takes a while to get blood, out of the refrigerator and into the patient. So here's your scene time, or your PD response time on scene is 2020, and then our blood wasn't going in until 2034. She had an ED thoracotomy 11 minutes after this initial scene time. That was the earliest one I could find. And she had pulses that returned with open compressions, but then she ended up dying in the operating room. So, and just to kind of like highlight what the kind of the point of no return. Once she was opened up and cross-clamped, they cross-clamped the aorta. This area here is where she was shot kind of like here. And she got cross-clamped above the aorta. This area is a prime area for the need for permissive hypotension, because this is where you need to clot or we can't do anything. And there's a finite amount of time too, because once you've bled, 5 liters, it doesn't matter. Like you're gonna have a non-survivable injury essentially at that point. So this is zone 1. That's her injury was in zone 1. Zone 2 is kind of like kidney area, and zone 3 is an injury area where there's more options for stuff that we can do, because it's kind of like farther away from the heart and the big lower pressure vessels. And this is not her, but this is kind of what happens. We open up the chest, and then typically open up the heart to see if there's bleeding around the heart, and then cross-clamp the aorta, which is, there's another time component to that, because things start to go very wrong. This is my little clamp here. This is laying supine. So she was obviously in severe shock, and that time is what we need to decrease. So the time to kind of like get people registered, call the blood bank, get them to unlock the fridge, pull the blood out, prime the stuff, all of that can start happening now with you guys, and it will help this mortality hopefully decrease. So key takeaways: permissive hypotension is key. I mean, that if they have a head injury, 100 systolic, 110 is great. If they don't have a head injury, and you're like watching them exsanguinate while talking to you, then probably 70 systolic is fine. 90 is great. I think when they did a lot of this data on for permissive hypotension on cases in the operating room where they could watch patients that were getting kind of like resuscitated intraoperatively start bleeding again. And it was like right around like 70 to 90 systolic is when people started bleeding again. So it's okay. You're not going to be, that's great if you can get them to 70 to 90. And then time of injury is like time 0, just to keep that in mind, because we also get fixated on like, oh, their arrival time doesn't matter. Their injury time is when the clock starts. This is a medical bleeding case that just super quickly I'll go through. I don't have the run sheet, but she was extremely hypotensive at her house. She was kind of like, it was a GI bleed situation. And just so you know, a lot of agencies are finding that close to half of their patients end up being medical bleeding, which is typically GI bleeds and OB. So those would be, that ends up being like half of the population that needs this. Just so you know, it's not gonna be all GSWs. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight really quick, on her exam, yes, she was super hypotensive, but she also has a significant history where she could kind of live hypotensive. But look at her pulse pressure variation here. She was pretty narrow, probably from the 2 liters that was in her bed. So typically, widened pulse pressure is going to be, your head patients, like your TBIs, those are going to have the widened pulse pressure, and your narrow ones are going to be your hemorrhaging patients are going to show that first. TBI, and then early hemorrhage. Also, tamponade can show that. Tamponade would be, in trauma, would be something we would do a thoracotomy for. And then sometimes you can see it in CHF and MIs and dehydration. Okay, so in older adults, one of the pitfalls is they often will not have an appropriate physiologic response to shock because they're on beta blockers or calcium channel blockers, and they just can't respond the way they should. So just keep that in mind. Maybe they have an AICD too that's like shocking them out of their appropriate tachycardia. And then another thing to keep in mind with the geriatric population is that only a 0.1 increase in shock index can increase mortality 12.3%. So that's pretty significant. They do a lot worse. They don't bounce back. Okay, really quick, this is a good example of a zone 3 bleed. This patient was on I-5. This is a TFD case. On I-5, got hit. He actually, the person in front of him stopped and he hit them on his motorcycle and then kind of got launched. He ended up having these highlighted areas are his super bleedy injuries. Big right hemopneumothorax, inferior splenic laceration, abdominal wall hematomas, open book pelvis, right acetab, pubic rami fracture, lateral wall hematoma. They were not able to get a blood pressure on him. He was combative the entire time coming to TG. But his heart rate was in the 160s. On arrival, he was, here's some of his vitals here. So his stroke index for us continued after arrival to be super high despite getting a bunch of blood. So that's kind of that deficit that you're trying to catch up. We finally, several hours after arrival, got him down to 0.9 for his stroke index, or sorry, not stroke index, shock index. That was a typo for me, sorry. So just to keep in mind too, with this, we have to remember we still have to stop the bleeding process before we start filling the tank. This patient had a pretty good, I don't know if you can see it because it's kind of dark, but this is his pubic symphysis here. Pretty wide. This is supposed to be. So that's him. The motorcycle, that's your typical injury that gets those. He had a lot of bleeding into his pelvis, and he was bleeding actually from here, right about here. And he got embolized, and he got his pelvis ORIF'd. There's his with the binder on, pubic symphysis is closed, and that's him with his new found hardware, friends. Yeah, that's sideways. You can see the lag screw in there. But that just goes to show you're gonna have to put the tourniquet on the pelvis too, or the arm or whatever, before you gonna stop that from going into where it's not supposed to be. Okay, he was in severe shock. Okay, so just some takeaways from this case. Absence of bleeding does not exclude significant hemorrhage. He did not have obvious bleeding, but he was bleeding into his pelvis. Mental status, high mechanism of injury, especially with high-speed pedestrian trucks and motorcycles are the ones we see. Assume they're bleeding. You know, there's an old trauma surgeon used to say, nobody dies without a binder on, which for blunt trauma, nobody dies without a binder on. They're the tourniquet for the pelvis, so close the ring and fill the tank. And then in TBI too, he had a significant TBI, and he was like super crazy for months with us. But it is very easy for us to fixate on the TBI and assume like that's their main malfunction, because it's very distracting. Like people can be like punching at you and stuff, but they also may have some other stuff going on. And it's difficult too, because you have to kind of sedate them to get their workup done, and it's difficult. Also, the coagulopathies with TBI can be quite significant. Bleedy coagulopathies and clotty coagulopathies. So those have been studied, especially since the OAF and OIF wars. Okay, here's some Central Pierce cases. Hopefully somebody stops me when you're good. Okay, so this one's from, this one's actually from September. This was Medic 65. This was a 2-car crash. I can't remember where it was, but this lady was bleeding significantly from her scalp wound, and she lost quite a bit of blood, and her shock index was like, it went up even after arrival to us. And she got blood in the trauma bay. This is not her. I do have a picture of her, but I didn't want to put it in. But it was similar to this, but it was even more degloved. Like she just had like a whole chunk of her head. And it can seem like, oh, it's like a scalp laceration, but you can lose a lot of blood from your scalp laceration. So just don't discount the bleeding that can come from wounds that appear superficial but are like bleeding. They seem like more than normal. It's very vascular. So she was bleeding from kind of like this area here, super vascular, and she lost a lot of blood. This was her. She had a heart rate in the 120s to 130s. And then she soaked through 2 trauma pads, and her total like EBL in the run sheet was 500 to 700 or 750 mLs. So she would have been in that category now with the new criteria to be a trauma red, because her heart rate was greater than her systolic. And she ended up getting blood with us. And we would put her kind of like right here, 2 to 3 class shock, which would be they need blood. So trends are significant. Don't like take one picture at any given time. Like that's kind of, the trends are more significant than any given like number that you could look at. And then scalp skin bleed, as I'm sure know. All right, this one's a GSW case. This one was Medic 72. This patient was actually not hypotensive, but ended up needing a lot of blood. So this was a step 2. This is prior to changing the criteria, so it was a step 2 that was translated to a full trauma. This patient went for a trauma XLAP after arrival, got a right hemicolectomy, liver packing, temporary abdominal closure, and a chest tube placement. Had a chest seal placed and a tourniquet to the arm, needed a needle decompression. Airway, there was a lot of blood in the airway, so oral ET tube was not able to be placed, but an iGel was placed successfully. The shock index started to increase. As you can see here, like this guy was super tachycardic. The trend continued to increase. He went for a trauma XLAP, and he had a leader in his belly. He got 1 RBC, 1 FFP in the ER, and then 1 and 1 in the OR. So this would have been a good one. So he had a big zone 2 retroperitoneal hematoma. So when you guys get fast exam or ability to do fast exams, those are ones where you're not gonna be able to see them very well, sadly. So we would put him kind of like right here, class 3 shock, and he would need blood. And you may not have low blood pressure in that. See, like it could, but his heart rate was increased and he was indeed bleeding. So blood mobilization, so calling for the mobilization of that resource to the scene early is super important. And I know that's going to be kind of a learning curve, so hopefully, you know, they'll be able to rework through. But things like this would be a great indicator, like, you know, multiple GSWs to the torso, probably should mobilize that resource. And then just remember, blood pressure is a late sign of shock. And then respiratory distress can also mean blood is needed and maybe not necessarily an airway. Related to this case, some agencies that have implemented blood have noticed their intubations go down because people don't need airways anymore. They just needed blood. Just keep that in mind. Okay, so this one's a super duper sad case that we don't exactly know all the injuries because this patient was kind of like past the point of no return on arrival. It was super sad. He was dragged after, like it was like during a driving lesson with his daughter. And yeah, you guys probably know about this, super sad, so sad. We were all just like so depressed about this. So this patient kind of went from talking to 80 over palp, heart rate of 120s, and then pulses lost en route. He he ended up only getting bilateral thoracostomies in the trauma bay, and it was called because he just did not have signs of life by that point. So this case I think is interesting because there's a very limited amount of stuff that we can do with traumatic arrest. There's just a few things. There's not like, it's not like, you know, the utility of ACLS in a traumatic arrest is minimal. And I know that the guidelines are still out there, obviously follow those, but we're finding that, here's just some kind of data points here, you know, like all the things were done, CPR, epi, etc., but we don't have blood, so there's only so much you can do. Oh yeah, and before I go on about the traumatic arrests, this was the time frame that I think we're gonna have to start thinking about with these cases, because if they look okay, but there's like something significant in their mechanism, like pedestrian structs tend to be ones that have kind of, you should have like a pucker factor almost for like, this might be, they may be more hurt than they look like. But here's your time frame, your window time frame for potential blood dispatch or rendezvous, or however we're going to make that work. And then skin vitals are significant on this exam. So his postmortem did not show a lot because I don't think the family actually wanted like a full autopsy, but he clearly had some blunt force trauma to like shoulder head area. It was like his shoulder arm was kind of like hamburger meat is how it was described. But the window of opportunity for EMS was there, and then it had kind of closed for us. And so this is gonna add, having blood is gonna add like another adjunct to keep these people alive. So he had no cardiac activity on arrival. So he had exsanguinated to the point of no return really. And the chances of survival with no cardiac activity after blunt traumatic arrest are very, very minimal, unfortunately. So ACLS is not super helpful. This is an algorithm that I just wanted to show. This is from New Zealand, and it may be coming to the United States at some point. But this is basically traumatic arrest. The big things you can do are in the algorithm, the HOT algorithm. So hypovolemia, fix those, which is what we have now, like stopping bleeding and giving blood. optimizing oxygenation, alleviating tension pneumothoraces, which we do by needle and maybe at some point finger thoracostomies, and then fixing the cardiac tamponade, which the surgeons can do that, or I don't know, maybe needle. But other than that, there's not a lot of utility. Like if you're compressing an empty heart through the chest, it's not gonna have a great outcome. Anyway, this is New Zealand guidelines. So this case, obviously severe shock. His heart rate went up and then it went down, as we have all seen many times. So skin vitals, super important early on. And I think that our protocol here accounts for that. And questionable utility to ACLS and hemorrhagic traumatic cardiac arrest. And these are your goals: hypovolemia, addressing hypovolemia and oxygenation, tension pneumothoraces, and tamponade. Yep.
So guys, just to touch on the cardiac arrest part, like our protocol, it's 5 minutes, witness, CPR, right? Let me turn on. So, yep, our protocol says 5 minutes or less, it was witness and CPR was being done, right? So, obviously use that. It's a guideline, but I can tell you that there's lots of cases where people have, been in cardiac arrest, whether it's blunt or penetrating trauma with the delivery of blood. And if the blood's given very rapidly, they get pulses back, even regain consciousness, right? And patients have survived, where that person would not have survived prior to that, right? So I can tell you a story about SF friend of mine. It was a medic in Afghanistan in 2018, and he had a teammate of his that had from an RPG, had a traumatic bilateral amputation and also had large penetrating injury in his back. And within 2 minutes of injury, tourniquets replaced, the wound was packed, and within 5 minutes, he's in cardiac arrest. But my buddy, who's the medic, had 2 units of blood on his back, started an IO on him, external IO, and in 2 minutes had, squeezed that blood in as fast as he could. The guy was conscious when he put him on the helicopter. Got 6 more units of blood en route to the, trauma facility and is alive today. So, so.
PEA arrest is hypotension.
Yep.
That's why the cardiac activity is super important, but
Yeah. So the timeline's it's a real tight window, right? If we're not there within a certain time frame, it's probably not going to work, but it does work, because I've had a couple of those cases here while we've been working on this. I had an 18-year-old that was shot. Law enforcement said he lost pulses right before we got there. Guy had a finger in his neck, and had we had blood, kid probably would have lived, potentially, right? Or he would have been transported to the trauma hospital and potentially given that chance. So, hopefully those cases will give the people that chance now. So, all right. Any questions before we move on to the next? Yes, Jeff.
Yes, I have a comment, not a question. Hopefully generate a little bit of discussion on that time frame to get to whole blood. We're always taught limit time on scene, especially with trauma patients, to get to the hospital for definitive intervention, right? I think this is a little bit of a conversation for us to all have. One of the big things why we want to get to the hospital so fast is because of the blood. If we have the resource, blood coming to us at the scene, I think there's a concept there, a thought process to go through of maybe there is a little longer scene time because we have that life-saving resource within minutes, as opposed to they're not here, I'm going, and now we're saying, well, now it's 20 minutes until we get there. So it's just a concept for you guys to think about, for us to think about organizationally and how we approach that, and curious on any comments.
Yeah, and that's going to be a hard concept for us to really bite into, because we're so used to grab and go, right? And so we still want to have that mindset, but at the same time, how can we improve this patient's outcome? Because we have this product here. You got to ask yourself the question, are we going to delay it too much by waiting for it? Can I rely on EMS 1 to meet me somewhere because I'm going to Tacoma? Because MSO 6.2 is way out of position right now. There's options out there, and hopefully the system's going to grow within a year or two, we'll have more of that resource on the road so we can not, you know, have this problem. But then also remembering the timeframes that Dr. Gates talked about, right? So 13 minutes from time of trained hands-on, or 34 minutes from time of injury, right? To get that blood going. So keep that in mind. Like if we're not gonna get way out of that window, it's probably better for the patient, right? Because we're gonna stabilize them and hopefully put them in front of a surgeon so they'll survive on that surgical table, right? That's our goal, so. Yes.
So what I was gonna say is, one, it'd be helpful if the MSOs could give an ETA to the scene. Red or green on like. Better? It would be helpful if the MSOs would give an ETA when we call them, so we know, like, especially like for me, working 6-3 a lot, we're so far north, we can be to the hospital quick. So before this class in the morning, it's like, why wouldn't I go to the hospital? But now after this class, I get it. It might be advantageous to wait 5-10 minutes on scene, get the blood, because they're gonna eventually get it quicker, or like you just said, if we can start developing that so we know, or call EMS 1 or something like that.
And we will. We're gonna long-term, like we're gonna have spots where people can meet up that are pre-planned, and you know, especially I know Tacoma will, because they're gonna get the brunt of it from every agency in the county. And it's gonna be a work in progress. It's not gonna be perfect to begin with, but as we develop this thing, we'll start figuring out what we need to do to, you know, make this more successful. So, and we're gonna look at the data closely. I think we're gonna be sharing data and having a lot of conversations on it. Doc, you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think it's a delicate balance, right? Because you don't want to, because they have blood. Thanks. It's a delicate balance. You don't want to delay on scene too much, right? So there's going to be this, what's an appropriate delay and what's too much of a delay? Because really, some people need to be in the OR with their chest cracked or their belly opened ASAP. So granted, you want them to be there as healthy as possible when they get there. So you don't want to like wait on scene for blood if you're really delaying what they really need is the OR. So I think that really figuring out a way to get this and sort of like meet them on the way to the hospital, decrease your on-scene time, and still get the blood going is the right way to go, rather than like, hey, I'm going to sit here, stand pat for 10 minutes while this guy's dying in front of me, and I could have been at the hospital in 5, right? So I think that it's a tough balance, and I think we're going to be figuring that out. But I think that I would not like say like, yeah, that we're going to do, you know, and I think cardiac arrest, we can say when we're running a cardiac arrest in the field, a non-traumatic cardiac arrest, we're doing the same stuff that happens at the hospital, which is why we have the model that we do. We stay, we work the cardiac arrest. When it comes to trauma, we do not have the same stuff, right? We don't have surgeons, we don't have the OR, and that's what people need. So the balance is going to be figuring out, okay, well, I can get blood going and I can get rolling, and I'm not going to delay things too much on scene. But if you're looking at like, yeah, I'm going to hang out here and hope this guy doesn't die while I'm waiting for the MSO to show up with the blood, that's not the way I want you to think about it. So I think it's a pretty tight balance. And I think that trying to figure out a way to get the blood and keep moving at the same time is going to be the way that's going to work the best out of this. And if that's like, you know what, I'm going to meet you at the corner of 512 at the McDonald's, we're going to just jump in and we're going to go and we're leaving a rig here, that may be how it goes. But I think that that's something that we're going to have a pretty steep learning curve about in the short run, because I don't want the thought to be like, yeah, we can do exactly what the surgeons do. They're just going to give blood and wait, because that's not what they're going to do. They're going to give blood and they're going to do a whole bunch of other stuff.
Just to comment on that, right? Like, we're trying to combat that on the front end. We've been working with South Sound 911, Matt Black, on determining what calls are the MSO should go to first, right? These calls where we're kind of caught unaware should be few and far between. And the MSOs will be expected, they're going to be out on the road a lot, bouncing from call to call, right? So we're trying to combat this on the front end, but be a thinking medic, right? If you can say, hey, I needed to wait 2 minutes because I just got this blood here, of course we're going to support that, right?
All right. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
One thing that might be able to be implemented whenever Mary Bridge moves to their own spot. Okay.
Are you still mic'd up, or are you? Okay.
One thing that might be a possibility to help this everything move faster whenever Marybridge has their own spot, is a direct to OR program, which we have talked about, where you guys, with a subset that we know needs the inside of an operating room only, in addition to blood and, you know, whatever you guys can do, could just roll right up to the OR. So that might be something we can do when we have all 16 ORs to ourselves.
Awesome. All right, any other questions before we move on to the next part of this? Do we need a quick 5 minutes? Everyone good? Keep moving. All right, we're gonna roll into the hands-on. Have Major Taylor come up. You wanna bring your whole crew up too? So. Hey, Joe. Bouchard, we're gonna give these guys coins right now, so. All right. All right, before they get started, I just these guys have been instrumental. This is, if you don't know, this 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment from JBLM. They've been a huge help in getting us this program up and running and just the hands-on piece of it. And just want to say thanks. Can't thank you guys enough for doing this. So, Joe, you got coins from both TFD and from us. So, all right, thank you. Appreciate it. Here we go. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So, yeah, and our partners at Madigan too. He couldn't make it today, but we owe them a huge thank you, and Shelly and everyone that's been involved in this. So it's been a lot to make this happen, and appreciate it. So I'll turn it over to you for the hands-on piece. So. Oh. Thanks, Joe. Okay.
Hey, how you doing? Like he said, my name's Major Dave Taylor. I'm the battalion PA for 4th Battalion 160th. These are 3 of my medics, 2 of them flight medics, and 1 of my Whiskey 1 medics that I have. CJ Mammon, Bobby Bastillos, and Daniel Reyes. But so for my medics, this is the bread and butter of what they do on a regular basis, is they transport patients from the point of injury to a surgical team somewhere off-site of that area where people are shooting at you. Surgeons don't like to go places where they shoot at you. So this hands-on portion, we do a lot in training, and it's really good because it gets you a couple reps to do before you do this in real life when somebody's dying in front of you, because that's not really the place that you want to do that. I'm going to hand this over to Bobby, and we're going to kind of walk through the process of setting up the line, the whole way that we do this, and then we're going to break you up into 5 groups, and then you guys are going to give blood back to the people that just gave blood. All right? Perfectly safe. You're getting your own blood back. The risk is extremely low. We do this in training typically quite often, once a month or more, and when they're in SOCMAS, they do this every day on a regular basis, and when we're in SOAMIC, we do it for multiple days in a row as well. But this is Bobby.
Good afternoon, I'm Bobby. I'm gonna go over the application and the didactic portion of actually setting up the blood tubing. So you're gonna go ahead and open up your quantum tubing. It's about 80 inches long. It's a 200 micron filter. So it's gonna help filter out those clots or anything that's coming through the bloodline. It's interwoven with the heating system. So as you turn it on and plug it into the battery, it'll turn blue. Then as you start pushing blood, it'll take about 30 seconds. That's when it'll turn green, and that's what it's gonna let you know when the blood is warm. So first thing, what I like to do, you got all your little lower locks and all your rollers. I like to put those all in my line of sight, and you close them off all the way down at the bottom. So you're closing off all your tubing, making sure it's all closed off. Then you grab your saline bag, pop that open, throw it onto one of the sides. Then from there, you're gonna go ahead and open up your roller. Right down here is your drip chamber with your 200 micron filter. You want to go ahead and start pressing on that until it gets filled. Make sure when you're pressing on it not to push down too hard so you're not tearing that filter, because that's what's preventing all the clots from going into your body. Then from there, once you get that all filled up, go ahead and open up the bottom tubing. Make sure you get all the air out of the line so you're not pushing any air into the patient. Don't cause that air embolism or anything. Then once you get all that filter tubing all cleared out from the blood, you're gonna go ahead and close off your top tubing, top roller, grab your blood. Yep. Then from the blood, on the blood bag itself, there's these lips right there, you're gonna go ahead and spread those apart. Then you're gonna grab your spike from the wide tubing. Then from there, you're gonna go ahead and spike the bag, do the same thing as you did with the saline, and it's all gonna start going into the drip chamber. Making sure once you do that, you're ensuring that the saline portion, that's closed off, because if you open that up, with that still open, the blood's gonna shoot straight into the saline bag, and you make a little Kool-Aid concoction in there. Then from there, all the blood's gonna go into this filter tubing right here, and slowly start seeing it go from like a light pink to a dark red. Then once you see it's nice and fully red, go ahead and open up the roller from the bottom. You see the same thing that happened in the filter tubing, to turning a light pink, red, then making sure get it all the way down to the end of the line, close it off so you're not wasting blood, putting that on the floor. Next, we're gonna go into the application of the quantum battery. So that's your quantum battery. To turn it on, all you gotta do is grab the male portion of the adapter, plug it into the battery. You'll see the battery turn on. It's gonna give you 3 indicator lights.
This one.
Yeah, that one's dead. So it's gonna turn into 3 indicator lights. It's gonna be green, which is fully charged, amber, which is medium, then low, which is red. Then from there, on the tubing itself, there's an adapter portion where you can plug into the battery. Then from there, you see the whole line. It will start to turn like a blue color. Then once it's fully warm, it's gonna turn green. Then from there, turn on your roller, start the blood flowing into the patient. Does anybody have any questions at all? Yes.
It doesn't matter which line you hook the saline up to?
No, it doesn't matter at all. Yes, sir.
I've noticed that using this IV set, that the filter seems like the slow point. I mean, it seems like it takes 15 minutes to infuse the unit. Is that kind of where you guys?
It usually takes along that time, but we also have our pressure infuser bags that helps induce the flow of the line. But
So what I was getting at was, do you guys ever spike a second drip set into that unit? Would that make it go faster, or that's not that?
usually,
Like putting another drip set onto this
Yeah, because
one?
there's 2.
No, I don't think
that.
that would go any faster. So a lot of that's going to be always based upon the size of the IVs you use. So if you're here the first time, we had needle ports, and so we stuck ourselves only one time, so we didn't have to get stuck twice. You'll see it go a lot faster today. So if you do an 18 gauge and go straight off of this line, so you're not creating basically that constriction point twice, then it's going to go a lot faster overall. And anytime you go to a larger gauge, then you're going to have a much faster flow rate in overall.
Yeah, and the preferred is a 16 gauge or bigger. I mean, obviously you get what you can get, right? So when it comes to the IV line, and it will flow just fine through an IO. If you're gonna do an IO, try to go like femoral head or femur, distal femur, because those flow better typically. That, proximal tibia is gonna be a little bit slower, but you can do it, so.
The one key thing that we always bring up in this is, so once this line has blood in it, this line is just blood. Don't put anything else in this line. The biggest key with that is your protocols call for calcium as well.
Yes.
So
Yep.
you cannot put the calcium with the blood. You will cause it to clot in the line if you do that. So you have to have a second location to put the calcium in, or you'll have to flush that entire line through and then give it through the medication point after it's completely flushed out.
Yeah, so if you have a single line, we can put an extension set at the end of that, and we'll be carrying it. We'll have the 3-way stopcocks in there, so put it in between that. You can stop the blood, flush that section out, give the medications, and then reopen the line. Flush it again, right, and then start the blood again, all right? So, but bloods are most, so we want to give above everything, right? Like if you've got to give some meds, you got to give it. If you have one line, that's the workaround. We are going to have pressure bags, and we're going to get, yes.
Where in the algorithm is the calcium? Before blood, during blood?
I would say blood is your number one priority, right? If you have time beforehand and you're like, we're getting blood on board, you can give it ahead of time, but get the blood on. That's what's going to do the most. TXA and calcium can come after the fact. I mean, if you're really crunched for time, those are your priorities of work. But yeah, if you're getting the blood set up, you can go ahead and give that stuff ahead of time.
So for us in the TC3 protocols that cover the medics, it is the first unit of blood. After the first unit of blood is the first calcium, and then every third unit of blood after that, they give an additional calcium.
Yeah.
Most of my medics are flushing. No, so most of my medics are flushing their IVs with the TXA.
Yep.
So they pull up the TXA and they just straight flush it in that way. But we can do it. We're allowed to do a push with TXA. We don't have to drip.
Yep. And I did the same thing when I was still doing the Army thing. We did flusher, but like I said, get the blood on, calcium, our protocol mirrors TCCC, so get the blood on, calcium after that. But just a word of warning, when you pull these, because we have stored whole blood, when you pull these things out of the cooler, it's gonna be cold. And I don't know if you guys have ever done it with an IV bag, but it's really easy with the blood to take that spike and go through the side of the port into the blood bag. Once you do that, that unit's done, right? And you're gonna make a huge mess. So if you're spiking it, it's mostly gonna be an MSO thing. Be really, really diligent about not pushing that spike through the side of the port. So.
Bobby, do you have to prime the line with saline?
No, you don't have to prime the line with saline. You can go straight blood.
Yeah.
So, yeah, in extremis, the problem is you only have blood in that line, and then getting the last of that blood out of that bag or through that line into the patient is a portion of blood the patient doesn't get. So it all depends on how your unit's gonna decide to do that for them.
It makes the process a lot cleaner. We can do it without, like I said, so. Any other?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention, when you guys start using pressure infusers with this line, so if you guys are depending on what kind of pressure infuser you guys get, so a lot of people will hang the pressure infuser and like the blood and the saline all on one side. And so the thing with this line, sometimes when this is plugged in right here, a lot of times this line will get kinked and a lot of people won't notice until like you notice you're 10 minutes down the road and the blood is still full. So just something to think about when you guys are hooking up the blood, just making sure you're always reassessing your lines and just making sure the blood's flowing.
Last talking point, so the faster we push the fluid, the less warm it's gonna get through the fluid warmer.
Yes.
Do we know like how much less warmer? And then also if we're having issues with our fluid warmer, we're just gonna push the flow of blood because he needs blood.
Yeah,
That
so,
is just a talking point.
so based on the manufacturer of the Quantum, they say that once you're pushing it past that 100 M, it gets it up to at least 36 to 37, which I think it typically warms it up to 40 if it's working, or 38, sorry, 38. But 37 being body temperature, right? So it's just a couple degrees below it if you're pushing it faster. It's still warming. It'll blink, what does it blink, green or blue? Yeah.
Blue once it starts getting
Yep.
colder.
Yep.
So this doesn't transfer 100%, and don't ever let somebody tell you not to push warm blood if you have the opportunity to push warm blood. But they did a study last summer, not long ago, but where they basically took college students, had them exercise to the point that they had a core temperature that was 102, and then they did a crossover study. So they had one group, the initial group, get room temperature fluid, and one group get cold saline to see if they could lower body temperature. Gave them a rest period, came back the next day, did a crossover, and split them across. There's no difference in 1 liter of fluid transferring over from cold IV fluid to room temperature IV fluid. And realistically, if you think about this, this makes sense when you're talking about the surface area of the amount of blood that it has to go through, the surface area of the body, and the amount of volume that you're actually pushing in. So you're pushing in 500 milliliters of fluid that, if it's cold, is relatively small in comparison to the volume of blood that's in someone's body in that scenario. So if you can, give warm blood, but don't ever think that you shouldn't give blood if you can't warm blood.
All right.
Did you say the minimum size is 16?
Yeah, it's preferred. You can go, I think the smallest like is 22. I mean, yeah, 22, but gauge. It will. I mean, I think blood's going through our capillaries, right? Sure. So, but as far as what the volume we're gonna give, obviously 16, or if you're trying to get that good volume, 16 or bigger is your best case scenario. So we don't have to. It'll flow just fine through an 18. I've given blood through an 18 and it flows fine. The preferred is 16 or bigger.